Hello, and good evening. I am Sam, and you are listening to Chilliteracy, where tonight, in a bit, I will be reading some more weird tales of William Hope Hodgson. I did some a couple of weeks ago. Couldn't stream last week, was not feeling up to it, but I'm back. And, gonna do the stuff that I was gonna read last week. It's been 1 week, a little while since I've read some of these stories. I did like a brief skim and catch up today just to remind myself of bits and pieces and make a couple of notes here and there. But I might flub a little bit, but that's part of the live experience. This ain't your note perfects, immaculately performed David Tennant and Andy Serkis read you Doctor Who versus Lord of the Rings. It's me reading live. Hello. But first, how are you? How is everybody? I hope people have been enjoying the cat pictures that I've been spamming of Joey all day everywhere, because he looks very cute asleep on the pillow. And I thought, hey, why not, make some hay while the sun is shining? And hay in this case is, content farming online, and the sun shining being a cat asleep on a pillow. So I took some pictures, and there you go. And speaking of which, if you are perhaps by any chance someone who has found the channel by way of one of those things, because I stuck it on the Chilliteracy account on Mastodon, because we have a Mastodon account, because good grief, Twitter's been going down the drain for a long time now, and it's just embarrassing to click on the X icon. It's so edgy on my phone to open it up for anything other than to just share a post. So I die a little inside every time I have to do that for work. The less I have to do it, the better. So yeah, I made us a Mastodon account. If you don't have to even make an account. You can just click on there every now and then and see when I put stuff. But yes, I put that there. And if you should happen to be someone who has seen that and thought, hey, I'm going to click over and see what this channel's about, welcome. It's good to have you here. This is what we do. We have. You don't have to see our faces, because frankly, me at least, I don't know about Lucy, I can't speak for her, but I'd certainly feel extremely self-conscious sitting here reading and effectively kind of slightly performing the stories that we read, knowing that people are looking at my face, whereas this just helps you listen to the story a bit. It sounds like you love having a parasocial relationship with internet cats. It's probably a good way to be honest. You kind of just get the best bits. Well, most of the best bits. You don't get to, smoosh the face, but other than that, never too many cat pics. Alright, noted. I will do. But yeah, he is still asleep in here, on his pillow, where he is currently chosen to be. Shouldn't really affect things in the grand scheme, but I'm in a slightly different position, because we're sort of halfway through the process of constructing and installing a new desk in my room, and it's not just like an IKEA thing. It's being assembled bespoke to fit the space out of bits of wood and a big sheet of plywood. It's going to be enormous and lovely when it's done, but it's just taken a little while to do, so I'm on a bit of a temporary desk setup elsewhere in my room, and it's fine. It's not exactly ideal or comfortable. Component parts, fine. I'm sat on the side of my bed, which, sitting on the bed, that's fine. Yeah, but sitting up for 2 hours reading a book, that's a bit. But, yeah, it should be alright. But, I don't know. As I say, it shouldn't actually affect anything in any way, but in case anything seems weird or different, let's just blame it on that. Yeah, anything else? Other things, I've started now trying to remember to keep a pad of paper and a pencil on the desk, so that if I need to make notes about things, I can do that. And I left a note to myself to shout out the Mastodon account and anyone who's here from that. So that's done. Good, we can tick that off. Nice. And secondly, I was watching a streamer who I regularly try to watch on they mainly stream on I guess Saturday and Sunday. They do some midweek streams as well. Urban Bohemian. Who really, really lovely guy, really good community. If you ever followed us over to Stephen Kill, very they're good friends. and sort of in the same kind of streaming community and stuff. And so like a lot of audience crossover, and frankly just a lot of vibes crossover with the channels. And so, thank you. Yeah, and they were streaming a game earlier, like a number of games. One that was called Pros and Codes, Pros, Prose, which is how best to quickly describe it. Basically, it gives you like an extract, like a quote of some kind from a public domain work. You can choose your topics, so it'd be like great thinkers or sci-fi or mystery and stuff, and it'll give you an extract from that with a bunch of letters missing and sort of so letters, essentially you're filling in the blanks to complete the quote, but it's like a bunch of letters missing and you have to try and guess from the ones that are missing. It gives you like I guess a cipher, like a code for what it is. So underneath is other letters that represent the ones that have been missing or been removed. And I bring it up because I was watching this earlier, and because it's closely involved with Project Gutenberg. I think they give like a 10% donation off every sale to Project Gutenberg, which we use quite a lot on here. And I was watching this, like seeing all these quotes come up and thinking, I know that one. Oh, it's H.G. Wells from The Time Machine. Like, oh, this looks familiar. Oh, that's from The Secret Garden. And yeah, it was just quite funny sort of watching all these sort of quotes come up and thinking, hang on a second, we've read that author, I know this. And then, there's another one from Jekyll and Hyde and stuff. And excuse me, some pretty good quotes as well. The ones I sort of missed while reading the first time. The shout out link doesn't seem. Oh, that's true. Oh, maybe it's because the @ is in there. Yes. That'll be it. Yeah, because it's put. I guess for a shout out like that, you just don't have the @ in the name. I would have done the same thing, frankly. But yes, thank you, Andy Pants. So very good stream. Lovely guy, lovely community. Worth watching. It's just a nice chill place to start, for me, to start my Saturday. And hey, anyone else too. But yeah, I guess. Oh, text. That's true. That's the other thing I need to do. Yeah, I have those. Don't worry. I'm prepared. I'm good at this. I've been doing this for 3 years. Oh, yeah. Haha. Yeah. Book Week. Working title. Until we come up with a better name. A reminder. Starting on the 14th of August. Lucy, shout at me if I've just completely forgotten the date and I'm saying the wrong one. Week. Yeah, let's call it that. Starting on the 14th of August. To celebrate the 3rd anniversary of this channel. Our 3rd year of streaming, or the start of the 3rd year. I don't know what is time. How does it even work? We will be doing a week of streams on this channel, where Lucy and myself will roughly kind of be alternating back and forth, taking a stream each day, along different subjects. It's the end of our 2nd year, start of our 3rd. Yeah, second anniversary, I suppose. Yeah, you're one after the 1st year. What? Sure. We do words here, not maths, okay? And yeah, so that will be happening. Very looking forward to it. We started planning it a little while back. Solidified plans the other day. Information about that is up on the Discord. More will be coming up. We've got 1 year left until Grandpa's Ghost comes back to judge us. No! We've not even started the community centre. What is it? It's end of summer. Quick, what can we grow in the next few days before summer ends and we go into autumn, and then we have to wait until... Stardew jokes. Reminder, actually, to anyone that's listening, those of you that... I can see there's people listening. If there are any short stories from more or less the 1st year, but we can stretch it a bit, that you would like to hear reread, do please shout them out. Feel free to go over the YouTube archives if you like. Hint, shout out for the YouTube archives. To have a look at what we've done, because certainly for me, some of the audio quality and some of the reading quality in that 1st year wasn't as good as it is now. I mean, obviously I'm always improving, I hope, but always trying to improve anyway. But yeah, it'd be nice to go back and do some of those. So we had a lot of suggestions for poems and a good archive of plays to go and sift through for some of the streams that we're doing there. But yeah, we have some other cool stuff coming up that week as well. We've got me doing some sci-fi. Gonna read some stuff by one of my sort of more recent favourite authors. Goes by the name of Quantum, QNTM, who I've mentioned. Sorry, Salad, you're never going to forget the first stream. It was such a funny situation for me. And Lucy with the Goodfellas threatening Joe Pesci. Funny how? What, like I amuse you like a clown? How am I funny? So let's see how that plays out in chat. It'll be great, and we'll have no voices by the end of it. Oh yeah, it's going to be... It's sort of like a marathon stream, but instead of all in one day, just stretched out over the course of a week. That's technically... You can run a marathon over the course of a week. Did you know? You just do it like bit by bit. You can take a month if you like. That's true. It's not true. Paroli, I haven't listened to many short story videos, but you like the wallpaper one. So that's... I will explain why I would love to reread that one, but I have a problem in that sometime after reading it, I learned that, unfortunately, the author of it, was it Charlotte Perkins Gilman, I think, was apparently pretty racist and had some, like, kind of terrible views on, like, slave ownership and stuff, which... apparently, like, wasn't that widely known, and then you sort of find people who know it, and it's like, yeah, this stuff isn't taught in school at all, and it's a real shame. It's like, yeah, people should know this, and you know, it's. I feel like it's kind of not as synonymous with her name as, say, like Lovecraft, who's another one that I just don't want to read on this channel because, frankly, his views they're not even subtext; they're just there in the text. But yeah, it's just one that for me, it's like, sure, it's not there in the book, like the work itself is, separating art from artist, the story is really, really good, and I really enjoyed it, and I would love to read it again. But to me, the views and attitudes that I read that she had are kind of now inseparable. Like, I'm not going to be able to read it without feeling like I'm promoting someone who had awful views. And so, yeah, and it's a real shame, because, as I say, I would love to, but I'm not gonna. Don't want to touch it, unfortunately. Like, I've not taken it down off YouTube, because it's kind of a judgment call, and, like, I guess, yeah, but I sort of can't mention a name, frankly, without bringing this all up, which is why, yeah, I don't feel comfortable going back to it, unfortunately. You can understand it feels a bit yuck to read it on stream. Yeah, exactly, and that's the thing. It's like, you read that story in one of your college classes and you thought it was really cool, and then you found out later and it was yeah, exactly. That's what happened to me. I was like, hey, people are talking about the yellow wallpaper. That's a great stuff. Oh no, and yeah, just like, well, that's a shame. That's the first story you read on the channel, isn't it? So yeah, we just try to find other stuff that's written by people who, I mean, again, part of the problem with reading a lot of work from 70 plus years ago is that you're going to find a lot of people held those kind of views, and it's not a justification for it. You also had good people back then who weren't racist and didn't think that was normal and how people should be treated, but there was still a lot of it around, and it's just kind of difficult to navigate that minefield, I suppose. But yeah, we do what we can and try to be sensitive, aware, and respectful as best as we can. Yeah. Wow, this got into other places. But yeah, I guess I would say then, if there's anything besides that, feel free to suggest it. Yeah, you don't have to go and listen. Even just like have a click through and say like, oh, you read this. Well, I can't be bothered to listen now, but I'll catch it on stream. That would be cool. Then you have people like Catherine Mansfield and Virginia Woolf and May Sinclair, who are all badasses. Exactly, that's the thing. And again, that's why it's like, it's the, oh, they were just like that then, isn't an excuse, because you also had people who weren't, and people who could see right from wrong. And yeah, it's just a whole discussion. But I think, now that I've sat here and talked for like 20 minutes or so, should we read a story? Because actually these ones are a little bit longer, so we might be going a bit longer than I expected tonight. This first story, which is called The Horse of the Invisible, it is another Karnaki story. And worry not, this one features, I'm going to say, well, certainly 100% less cruelty to cats and animals that we love. I think pretty much every animal, like, sure, it mentions a horse, but I don't think any harm actually comes to horses in the story. Apologies for reminding actually anyone who, that was a bit too much last time, and frankly, apologies for not giving, I guess, enough of a warning beforehand. As we said at the end, the cat was fine. Don't worry about it. It's all good. It used up one of its lives and it's back. But yeah, this is The Horse of the Invisible, and it's another Karnaki investigation, who, if you remember, was Hodgson's sort of supernatural Sherlock Holmes kind of figure, modelled after an Algernon Blackwood character, I think John Silence. I should really look up that name, because I say it the same every time, of John Silence, I think was his name. And yeah, it's about a friend of an investigator who goes round to his house to hear the stories of his latest escapades, and The Horse of the Invisible is one of those. So, if you'll forgive me creaking and rustling as I adjust myself to sit and read, yeah, your text is linked in chat. If you are ready, then I guess we shall begin. The Horse of the Invisible by William Hope Hodgson. I had that afternoon received an invitation from Karnaki. When I reached his place, I found him sitting alone. As I came into the room, he rose with a perceptibly stiff movement and extended his left hand. His face seemed to be badly scarred and bruised, and his right hand was bandaged. He shook hands and offered me his paper, which I refused. Then he passed me a handful of photographs and returned to his reading. Now, that is just Karnaki. Not a word had come from him, and not a question from me. He would tell us all about it later. I spent about half an hour looking at the photographs, which were chiefly snaps, some by flashlight, of an extraordinarily pretty girl, though in some of the photographs it was wonderful that her prettiness was so evident. For so frightened and startled was her expression that it was difficult not to believe that she had been photographed in the presence of some imminent and overwhelming danger. The bulk of the photographs were of interiors of different rooms and passages, and in every one the girl might be seen either full length in the distance or closer, with perhaps little more than a hand or arm, or portion of the head or dress included in the photograph. All of these had evidently been taken with some definite aim that did not have for its first purpose the picturing of the girl, but obviously of her surroundings, and they made me very curious, as you can imagine. Near the bottom of the pile, however, I came upon something definitely extraordinary. It was a photograph of the girl, standing abrupt and clear in the great blaze of a flashlight, as was plain to be seen. Her face was turned a little upward, as if she had been frightened suddenly by some noise. Directly above her, as though half-formed and coming down out of the shadow, was the shape of a single, enormous hoof. I examined this photograph for a long time, without understanding it more than that it had probably to do with some queer case in which Karnaki was interested. When Jessup, Arkwright, and Taylor came in, Karnaki quietly held out his hand for the photographs, which I returned in the same spirit, and afterwards we all went in to dinner. When we had spent a quiet hour at the table, we pulled our chairs round and made ourselves snug, and Karnaki began. I've been up north, he said, speaking slowly and painfully between puffs at his pipe. Up to Hisgins of East Lancashire. It has been a pretty strange business all round, as I fancy you chaps will think, when I have finished. I knew, before I went, something about the horse story, as I have heard it called, but I had never thought of it as coming my way somehow. Also, I know now that I had never considered it seriously, in spite of my rule to always keep an open mind. Funny creatures, we humans. Well, I got a wire asking for an appointment, which of course told me that there was some trouble. On the date I fixed, old Captain Hisgins himself came up to see me. He told me a great many new details about the horse story, though naturally I had always known the main points and understood that if the first child were a girl, that girl would be haunted by the horse during her courtship. It is, as you can see, already an extraordinary story, and though I have always known about it, I have never thought it to be anything more than an old-time legend, as I have already hinted. You see, for 7 generations the Hisgin family have had men-children for their firstborn, and even the Hisgins themselves have long considered the tale to be little more than a myth. To come to the present, the eldest child of the reigning family is a girl, and she has been often teased and warned in jest by her friends and relations that she is the first girl to be the eldest for 7 generations, and that she would have to keep she would have to keep her men friends at arm's length, or go into a nunnery if she hoped to escape the haunting. And this, I think, shows us how thoroughly the tale had grown to be considered as nothing worthy of the least serious thought. Don't you think so? 2 months ago, Miss Hisgins became engaged to Beaumont, a young naval officer, and on the evening of the very day of the engagement, before it was even formally announced, a most extraordinary thing happened which resulted in Captain Hisgins making the appointment, and my ultimately going down to their place to look into the thing. From the old family records and papers that were entrusted to me, I found that there could be no possible doubt, but that prior to something like 150 years ago there were some very extraordinary and disagreeable coincidences, to put the thing in the least emotional way. In the whole of the 2 centuries prior to that date there were 5 firstborn girls out of a total of 7 generations of the family. Each of these girls grew up to maidenhood, and each became engaged, and each one died during the period of the engagement. 2 by suicide, 1 by falling from a window, 1 from a broken heart, presumably heart failure, owing to sudden shock through fright. The 5th girl was killed one evening in the park round the house, but just how there seems to be no exact knowledge. Only that there was an impression that she had been kicked by a horse. She was dead when found. Now, you see, all of these deaths might be attributed, in a way, even the suicides, to natural causes. I mean as distinct from supernatural. You see? Yet, in every case, the maidens had undoubtedly suffered some extraordinary and terrifying experiences during their various courtships. For in all of the records there was mention either of the neighing of an unseen horse, or of the sounds of an invisible horse galloping, as well as many other peculiar and quite inexplicable manifestations. You begin to understand, now, I think, just how extraordinary a business it was that I was asked to look into. I gathered from one account that the haunting of the girls was so constant and horrible that 2 of the girls' lovers fairly ran away from their lady loves. And I think it was this, more than anything else, that made me feel that there had been something more in it than a mere succession of uncomfortable coincidences. I got hold of these facts before I had been many hours into the house, and after this I went pretty carefully into the details of the thing that happened on the night of Miss Hisgins' engagement to Beaumont. It seemed that as the 2 of them were going through the big lower corridor, just after dusk and before the lamps had been lighted, there had been a sudden, horrible neighing in the corridor, close to them. Immediately afterward, Beaumont received a tremendous blow or kick, which broke his right forearm. And then the rest of the family and the servants came running to know what was wrong. Lights were brought, and the corridor, and afterwards the whole house, searched, but nothing unusual was found. You can imagine the excitement in the house, and the half-incredulous, half-believing talk about the old legend. Then, Later, in the middle of the night, the old captain was waked by the sound of a great horse galloping round and round the house. Several times after this, both Beaumont and the girl said that they had heard the sounds of hoofs near to them after dusk in several of the rooms and corridors. 3 nights later, Beaumont was waked by a strange neighing in the night time, seeming to come from the direction of his sweetheart's bedroom. He ran hurriedly for her father, and the two of them raced to her room. They found her awake and ill with sheer terror, having been awakened by the neighing seemingly close to her bed. The night before I arrived, there had been a fresh happening, and they were all in a frightfully nervy state, as you can imagine. I spent most of the first day, as I have hinted, in getting hold of details, but after dinner I slacked off and played billiards all the evening with Beaumont and Miss Hisgins. We stopped about 10 o'clock and had coffee, and I got Beaumont to give me full particulars about the thing that had happened the evening before. He and Miss Hisgins had been sitting quietly in her aunt's boudoir, whilst the old lady chaperoned them, behind a book. It was growing dusk, and the lamp was at her end of the table. The rest of the house was not yet lit, as the evening had come earlier than usual. Well, it seems that the door into the hall was open, and suddenly the girl said, "Shush! What's that?" They both listened, and then Beaumont heard it. The sound of a horse outside of the front door. "Your father?" he suggested, but she reminded him that her father was not riding. Of course, they were both ready to feel queer, as you can suppose, but Beaumont made an effort to shake this off and went into the hall to see whether anyone was at the entrance. It was pretty dark in the hall, and he could see the glass panels of the inner draught door clear-cut in the darkness of the hall. He walked over to the glass and looked through into the drive beyond, but there was nothing in sight. He felt nervous and puzzled, and opened the inner door and went out onto the carriage circle. Almost directly afterward, the great hall door swung to with a crash behind him. He told me that he had a sudden, awful feeling of having been trapped in some way. That is how he put it. He whirled round and gripped the door handle, but something seemed to be holding it with a vast grip on the other side. Then, before he could be fixed in his mind that this was so, he was able to turn the handle and open the door. He paused a moment in the doorway and peered into the hall, for he had hardly steadied his mind sufficiently to know whether he was really frightened or not. Then he heard his sweetheart blow him a kiss out of the greyness of the big, unlit hall, and he knew that she had followed him from the boudoir. He blew her a kiss back, and stepped inside the doorway, meaning to go to her. And then, suddenly, in a flash of sickening knowledge, he knew that it was not his sweetheart who had blown him that kiss. He knew that something was trying to tempt him alone into the darkness, and that the girl had never left the boudoir. He jumped back, and in the same instant of time he heard the kiss again, nearer to him. He called out at the top of his voice, "Mary, stay in the boudoir! Don't move out of the boudoir until I come to you!" He heard her call something in reply from the boudoir, and then he had struck a clump of a dozen or so matches. I don't know why I struggled with that sentence. And then he had struck a clump of a dozen or so matches, and was holding them above his head and looking around the hall. There was no one in it. But even as the matches burned out, there came the sounds of a great horse galloping down the empty drive. Now, you see, both he and the girl had heard the sounds of the horse galloping, but when I questioned more closely, I found that the aunt had heard nothing, though it is true she is a bit deaf, and she was further back in the room. Of course, both he and Miss Hisgins had been in an extremely nervous state, and ready to hear anything. The door might have been slammed by a sudden puff of wind, owing to some inner door being opened, and as for the grip on the handle, that may have been nothing more than the sneck catching. With regard to the kisses and the sounds of the horse galloping, I pointed out that these might have seemed ordinary enough sounds if they had been only cool enough to reason. As I told him, and as he knew, the sounds of a horse galloping carry a long way on the wind, so that what he heard might have been nothing more than a horse being ridden some distance away. And as for the kiss, plenty of quiet noises, the rustle of a paper or a leaf, have a somewhat similar sound, especially if one is in an overstrung condition and imagining things. I finished preaching this little sermon on common sense versus hysteria as we put out the lights and left the billiard room, but neither Beaumont nor Miss Hisgins would agree that there had been any fancy on their parts. We had come out of the billiard room by this, and were going along the passage, and I was still doing my best to make both of them see the ordinary, commonplace possibilities of the happening, when what killed my pig, as the saying goes, was the sound of a hoof in the dark billiard room we had just left. I felt the creep come on me with a flash, up my spine and over the back of my head. Miss Hisgins whooped like a child with the whooping cough, and ran up the passage, giving little gasping screams. Beaumont, however, ripped round on his heels and jumped back a couple of yards. I gave back a bit too, as you can understand. "There it is," he said in a low, breathless voice. "Perhaps you'll believe now." "There's certainly something," I whispered, never taking my gaze off the closed door of the billiard room. "Hush," he muttered. "There it is again." There was a sound like a great horse pacing round and round the billiard room with slow, deliberate steps. A horrible, cold fright took me, so that it seemed impossible to take a full breath. You know the feeling. And then I saw we must have been walking backwards, for we found ourselves suddenly at the opening of the long passage. We stopped there and listened. The sounds went on steadily with a horrible sort of deliberateness, as if the brute were taking a sort of malicious gusto in walking about all over the room which we had just occupied. Do you understand what what I mean? Then there was a pause, and a long time of absolute quiet, except for an excited whispering from some of the people down in the big hall. The sound came plainly up the wide stairway. I fancy they were gathered round Miss Hisgins for some notion of protecting her. I should think Beaumont and I stood there at the end of the passage for about 5 minutes, listening for any noise in the billiard room. Then I realized what a horrible funk I was in, and I said to him, "I'm going to see what's there." "So am I," he answered. He was pretty white, but he had heaps of pluck. I told him to wait 1 instant, and I made a dash into my bedroom and got my camera and flashlight. I slipped my revolver into my right-hand pocket and a knuckle-duster over my left fist, where it was ready, and yet would not stop me from being able to work my flashlight. Then I ran back to Beaumont. He held out his hand to show me that he had a pistol, and I nodded, but whispered to him not to be too quick to shoot, as there might be some silly practical joking at work after all. He had got a lamp from a bracket in the upper hall, which he was holding in the crook of his damaged arm, so that we had a good light. Then we went down the passage towards the billiard room, and you can imagine that we were a pretty nervous couple. All this time there had not been a sound, but abruptly, when we were within perhaps a couple of yards of the door, we heard the sudden clumping of a hoof on the solid parquet floor of the billiard room. And a cat that wants to go out. 1 second. The cat has now gone. In the instant afterwards, it seemed to me that the whole place shook beneath the ponderous hoof-falls of some huge thing coming towards the door. Both Beaumont and I gave back a pace or two, and then realized, and hung on to our courage, as you might say, and waited. The great tread came right up to the door, and then stopped, and there was an instant of absolute silence, except that, so far as I was concerned, the pulsing in my throat and temples almost deafened me. I dare say we waited quite half a minute, and then came the further restless clumping of a great hoof. Immediately afterwards the sound came right on, as if some invisible thing passed through the closed door, and the ponderous tread was upon us. We jumped, each of us, to our side of the passage, and I know that I spread myself stiff against the wall. The clunk, 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 clunk of the great hoof falls passed right between us, and slowly, with the deadly deliberateness, down the passage. I heard them through a haze of blood beats in my ears and temples, and my body extraordinarily rigid and pringling, and I was horribly breathless. I stood for a little time like this, my head turned, so that I could see up the passage. I was conscious only that there was a hideous danger abroad. Do you understand? And then, suddenly, my pluck came back to me. I was aware that the noise of the hoofbeats sounded near the other end of the passage. I twisted quickly and got my camera to bear, and snapped off the flashlight. Immediately afterward, Beaumont let fly a storm of shots down the passage and began to run, shouting, "It's after Mary! Run! Run!" He rushed down the passage, and I after him. We came out onto the main landing and heard the sound of a hoof on the stairs, and after that, nothing. And from thence onward, nothing. Down below us in the big hall, I could see a number of the household round Miss Hisgins, who seemed to have fainted, and there were several of the servants clumped together a little way off, staring up at the main landing, and no one saying a single word. And about some 20 steps up the stairs was old Captain Hisgins with a drawn sword in his hand, where he had halted just below the last hoof sound. I think I never saw anything finer than the old man standing there between his daughter and that infernal thing. I dare say you can understand the queer feeling of horror I had at passing that place on the stairs where the sounds had ceased. It was as if the monster was still standing there, invisible, and the peculiar thing was that we never heard another sound of the hoof, either up or down the stairs. After they had taken Miss Hisgins to her room, I sent word that I should follow, so soon as they were ready for me. And presently, when a message came to tell me that I could come any time, I asked her father to give me a hand with my instrument box, and between us we carried it into the girl's bedroom. I had the bed pulled well out into the middle of the room, after which I erected the electric pentacle around the bed. Then I directed that lamps should be placed round the room, but that on no account must any light be made within the pentacle, neither must anyone pass in or out. The girl's mother I had placed within the pentacle, and directed that her maid should sit without, ready to carry any message, so as to make sure that Mrs. Hisgins did not have to leave the pentacle. I suggested also that the girl's father should stay the night in the room, and that he had better be armed. When I left the bedroom, I found Beaumont waiting outside the door, in a miserable state of anxiety. I told him what I had done, and explained to him that Miss Hisgins was probably perfectly safe within the protection, but that, in addition to her father remaining the night in the room, I intended to stand guard at the door. I told him that I should like him to keep me company, for I knew that he could never sleep feeling as he did, and I should not be sorry to have a companion. Also, I wanted to have him under my own observation, for there was no doubt but that he was actually in greater danger in some way than the girl. At least that was my opinion, and is still, as I think you will agree later. I asked him whether he would object to my drawing a pentacle round him for the night, and got him to agree. But I saw that he did not know whether to be superstitious about it, or to regard it more as a piece of foolish mumming. But he took it seriously enough when I gave him some particulars about the Black Veil case, when young Astor died. You remember, he said it was a piece of silly superstition, and stayed outside. Poor devil. The night passed quietly enough until a little while before dawn, when we both heard the sound of a great horse galloping round and round the house, just as old Captain Hisgins had described it. You can imagine how queer it made me feel, and directly afterward I heard someone stir within the bedroom. I knocked at the door, for I was uneasy, and the captain came. I asked whether everything was right, to which he replied yes, and immediately asked me whether I had heard the sounds of the galloping, so that I knew he had heard them also. I suggested that it might be as well to leave the bedroom door open a little until the dawn came in, as there was certainly something abroad. This was done, and he went back into the room to be near his wife and daughter. I had better say here that I was doubtful whether there was any value in the defence about Miss Hisgins, for what I term the personal sounds of the manifestation were so ordinarily material that I was inclined to parallel the case with that one of Harford's, where the hand of the child kept materializing within the pentacle and patting the floor. As you will remember, that was a hideous business. Yet, as it chanced, nothing further happened, and so soon as daylight had fully come, we all went off to bed. Beaumont knocked me up about midday, and I went down and made breakfast into lunch. Miss Hisgins was there, and seemed in very fair spirits, considering. She told me that I had made her feel almost safe for the first time in days. She told me also that her cousin, Harry Parsket, was coming down from London, and she knew that he would do anything to help fight the ghost. And after that, she and Beaumont went out into the grounds to have a little time together. I had a walk in the grounds myself and went round the house, but saw no traces of hoof marks. And after that I spent the rest of the day making an examination of the house, but found nothing. I made an end of my search before dark and went to my room to dress for dinner. When I got down, the cousin had just arrived, and I found him one of the nicest men I have met for a long time. A chap with a tremendous amount of pluck, and the particular kind of man I like to have with me in a bad case like the one I was on. I could see that what puzzled him most was our belief in the genuineness of the haunting, and I found myself almost wanting something to happen, just to show him how true it was. As it chanced, something did happen, with a vengeance. Beaumont and Miss Hisgins had gone out for a stroll just before the dusk, and Captain Hisgins asked me to come into his study for a short chat, whilst Parsket went upstairs with his traps, for he had no man with him. I had a long conversation with the old captain, in which I pointed out that the haunting had evidently no particular connection with the house, but only with the girl herself, and that the sooner she was married, the better it would give Beaumont a right to be with her at all times. I'll do that again. The sooner she was married, the better, as it would give Beaumont a right to be with her at all times, and further than this, it might be that manifestations would cease if the marriage were actually performed. The old man nodded agreement to this, especially to the first part, and reminded me that 3 of the girls who were said to have been haunted had been sent away from home, and met their deaths whilst away. And then, in the midst of our talk, there came a pretty frightening interruption. For all at once the old butler rushed into the room, most extraordinarily pale. "Miss Mary, sir," he gasped. "She's screaming, out in the park, sir, and they say they can hear the horse." The captain made one dive for a rack of arms and snatched down his old sword and ran out, drawing it as he ran. I dashed out and up the stairs, snatched my camera flashlight and a heavy revolver, gave one yell at Parsket's door, "The horse!" and was down into the grounds. Away in the darkness there was a confused shouting, and I caught the sounds of shooting out among the scattered trees. And then, from a patch of blackness to my left, there burst suddenly an infernal gobbling sort of neighing. Instantly I whipped round and snapped off the flashlight. The great light blazed out momentarily, showing me the leaves of a big tree close at hand, quivering in the night breeze. But I saw nothing else. And then the tenfold blackness came down upon me, and I heard Parsket shouting a little way back to know whether I had seen anything. The next instant he was beside me, and I felt safer for his company. For there was some incredible thing near to us, and I was momentarily blind because of the brightness of the flashlight. "What was it? What was it?" he kept repeating in an excited voice. And all the time I was staring into the darkness and answering mechanically, "I don't know. I don't know." There was a burst of shouting somewhere ahead, and then a shot. We ran towards the sounds, yelling to the people not to shoot, for in the darkness and panic there was this danger also. Then there came 2 of the gamekeepers racing hard up the drive with lanterns and their guns, and immediately afterward a row of lights dancing towards us from the house, carried by some of the men-servants. As the lights came up, I saw that we had come close to Beaumont. He was standing over Miss Hisgins, and he had his revolver in his hand. Then I saw his face, and there was a great wound across his forehead. By him was the captain, turning his naked sword this way and that, and peering into the darkness. A little behind him stood the old butler, a battle-axe from one of the arm-stands in the hall in his hands. Yet there was nothing strange to be seen anywhere. We got the girl into the house and left her with her mother and Beaumont, whilst a groom rode for a doctor. And then the rest of us, with 4 other keepers, all armed with guns and carrying lanterns, searched round the home park. But we found nothing. When we got back, we found that the doctor had been. He had bound up Beaumont's wound, which luckily was not deep, and ordered Miss Hisgins straight to bed. I went upstairs with the captain and found Beaumont on guard beside the girl's door. I asked him how he felt, and then, so soon as the girl and her mother were ready for us, Captain Hisgins and I went into the bedroom and fixed the pentacle again round the bed. They had already got lamps about the room, and after I had set the same order of watching as on the previous night, I joined Beaumont outside of the door. Parsket had come up while I had been in the bedroom, and between us we had got some idea from Beaumont as to what had happened out in the park. It seems that they were coming home after their stroll from the direction of the West Lodge. It had got quite dark, and suddenly Miss Hisgins said, "Hush!" and came to a standstill. He stopped and listened, but heard nothing for a little. Then he caught it, the sound of a horse, seemingly a long way off, galloping towards them over the grass. He told the girl that it was nothing and started to hurry her towards the house, but she was not deceived, of course. In less than a minute they heard it quite close to them in the darkness, and they started running. Then Miss Hisgins caught her foot and fell. She began to scream, and that is what the butler heard. As Beaumont lifted the girl, he heard the hoofs come thudding right at him. He stood over her and fired all 5 chambers of his revolver right at the sounds. He told us that he was sure he saw something that looked like an enormous horse's head right upon him, in the light of the last flash of his pistol. Immediately afterwards he was struck a tremendous blow which knocked him down, and then the captain and the butler came running up shouting. The rest, of course, we knew. About 10 o'clock the butler brought us up a tray, for which I was very glad, as the night before I had got rather hungry. I warned Beaumont, however, to be very particular not to drink any spirits, and I also made him give me his pipe and matches. At midnight I drew a pentacle round him, and Parsket and I sat one on each side of him, but outside of the pentacle, for I had no fear that there would be any manifestation made against anyone, except Beaumont or Miss Hisgins. After that, we kept pretty quiet. The passage was lit by a big lamp at each end, so we had plenty of light, and we were all armed, Beaumont and I with revolvers, and Parsket with a shotgun. In addition to my weapon, I had my camera and flashlight. Now and again we talked in whispers, and twice the captain came out of the bedroom to have a word with us. About 1:30 we had all grown very silent, and suddenly, about 20 minutes later, I held up my hand silently, for there seemed to me to be a sound of galloping out in the night. I knocked on the bedroom door for the captain to open it, and when he came, I whispered to him that we thought we had heard the horse. For some time we stayed, listening, and both Parsket and the captain thought they heard it, but now I was not so sure, neither was Beaumont. Yet afterwards I thought I heard it again. I told Captain Hisgins I thought he had better go back into the bedroom and leave the door a little open, and this he did. But from that time onward we heard nothing, and presently the dawn came in, and we all went very thankfully to bed. When I was called at lunchtime, I had a little surprise, for Captain Hisgins told me that they had held a family council and had decided to take my advice and have the marriage without a day's more delay than possible. Beaumont was already on his way to London to get a special license, and they hoped to have the wedding next day. This pleased me, for it seemed the sanest thing to be done in the extraordinary circumstances, and meanwhile I should continue my investigations, but until the marriage was accomplished my chief thought was to keep Miss Hisgins near to me. After lunch I thought I would take a few experimental photographs of Miss Hisgins and her surroundings. Sometimes the camera sees things that would seem very strange to normal human eyesight. With this intention, and partly to make an excuse to keep her in my company as much as possible, I asked Miss Hisgins to join me in my experiments. She seemed glad to do this, and I spent several hours with her, wandering all over the house, from room to room, and whenever the impulse came, I took a flashlight of her in the room or corridor in which we chanced to be at the moment. After we had gone right through the house in this fashion, I asked her whether she felt sufficiently brave to repeat the experiments in the cellars. She said yes, and so I rooted out Captain Hisgins and Parsket, for I was not going to take her even into what you might call artificial darkness, without help and companionship at hand. When we were ready, we went down into the wine cellar, Captain Hisgins carrying a shotgun, and Parsket a specially prepared background and a lantern. I got the girl to stand in the middle of the cellar, whilst Parsket and the captain held out the background behind her. Then I fired off the flashlight, and we went into the next cellar, where we repeated the experiment. Then, in the third cellar, a tremendous, pitch-dark place, something extraordinary and horrible manifested itself. I had stationed Miss Hisgins in the centre of the place, with her father and Parsket holding the background as before. When all was ready, and just as I pressed the trigger of the flash, there came in the cellar that dreadful, gobbling neighing that I had heard out in the park. It seemed to come from somewhere above the girl, and in the glare of the sudden light I saw that she was staring tensely upward, but at no visible thing. And then, in the succeeding comparative darkness, I was shouting to the captain and Parsket to run Miss Hisgins out into the daylight. This was done instantly, and I shut and locked the door, afterwards making sure the first and eighth signs of the Samar ritual opposite to each post, and connecting them across the threshold with a triple line. In the meanwhile, Parsket and Captain Hisgins carried the girl to her mother and left her there, in a half-fainting condition, whilst I stayed on guard outside of the cellar door, feeling pretty horrible, for I knew that there was some disgusting thing inside, and along with this feeling there was a sense of half-ashamedness, rather miserable, you know, because I had exposed Miss Hisgins to the danger. I had got the captain's shotgun, and when he and Parsket came down again, they were each carrying guns and lanterns. I could not possibly tell you the utter relief of spirit and body that came to me when I heard them coming, but just try to imagine what it was like standing outside of that cellar. Can you? I remember noticing, just before I went to unlock the door, how white and ghastly Parsket looked. And the old captain was grey-looking, and I wondered whether my face was like theirs. And this, you know, had its own distinct effect upon my nerves, for it seemed to bring the beastliness of the thing down onto me in a fresh way. I know it was only sheer willpower that carried me up to the door and made me turn the key. I paused one little moment, and then, with a nervy jerk, sent the door wide open and held my lantern over my head. Parsket and the captain came one on each side of me and held up their lanterns, but the place was absolutely empty. Joey, however, is back. He returned. The place was absolutely empty. Of course, I did not trust to a casual look of this kind, but spent several hours with the help of the two others in sounding every square foot of the floor, ceiling, and walls. Meow, indeed. You howling? Okay, you're going back to bed. All right. Yet, in the end, I had to admit that the place itself was absolutely normal. And so we came away. But I sealed the door, and outside, opposite each doorpost, I made the first and last signs of the Samar ritual, joining them as before with a triple line. Can you imagine what it was like, searching that cellar? When we got upstairs, I inquired very anxiously how Miss Hisgins was, and the girl came out herself to tell me that she was all right, and that I was not to trouble about her or blame myself, as I told her I had been doing. I felt happier then, and went off to dress for dinner, and after that was done, Parsket and I took one of the bathrooms to develop the negatives that I had been taking. Yet none of the plates had anything to tell us until we came to the one that was taken in the cellar. Parsket was developing, and I had taken a batch of the fixed plates out into the lamplight to examine them. I had just gone carefully through the lot when I heard a shout from Parsket, and when I ran to him he was looking at a partly developed negative which he was holding up to the red lamp. It showed the girl plainly looking upward as I had seen her, but the thing that astonished me was the shadow of an enormous hoof right above her, as if it were coming down upon her out of the shadows. And, I had run her bang into that danger. That was the thought that was chief in my mind. As soon as the developing was complete, I fixed the plate and examined it carefully in a good light. There was no doubt about it, at all. The thing above Miss Hisgins was an enormous, shadowy hoof, yet I was no nearer to coming to any definite knowledge, and the only thing I could do was to warn Parsket to say nothing about it to the girl, for it would only increase her fright. But I showed the thing to her father, for I considered it right that he should know. That night, we took the same precautions for Miss Hisgins' safety as on the 2 previous nights, and Parsket kept me company. Yet the dawn came in without anything unusual having happened, and I went off to bed. When I got down to lunch, I learned that Beaumont had wired to say that he would be in soon after 4, also that a message had been sent to the rector, and it was generally plain that the ladies of the house were in a tremendous fluster. Beaumont's train was late, and he did not get home until 5, but even then the rector had not put in an appearance, and the butler came in to say that the coachman had returned without him, as he had been called away unexpectedly. Twice more during the evening the carriage was sent down, but the clergyman had not returned, and we had to delay the marriage until the next day. That night I arranged the defence round the girl's bed, and the captain and his wife sat up with her as before. Beaumont, as I expected, insisted on keeping watch with me, and he seemed in a curiously frightened mood, not for himself, but for Miss Hisgins. He had a horrible feeling, he told me, that there would be a final dreadful attempt on his sweetheart that night. This, of course, I told him was nothing but nerves, yet really it made me feel very anxious, for I have seen too much not to know that, under such circumstances, a premonitory conviction of impending danger is not necessarily to be put down entirely to nerves. In fact, Beaumont was so simply and earnestly convinced that the night would bring some extraordinary manifestation that I got Parsket in to rig up a long cord from the wire of the butler's bell to come along the passage handy. To the butler himself I gave directions not to undress and to give the same order to 2 of the footmen. If I rang, he was to come instantly with the footmen carrying lanterns, and the lanterns were to be kept ready lit all night. If, for any reason, the bell did not ring and I blew my whistle, he was to take that as a signal in place of the bell. After I had arranged all these minor details, I drew a pentacle about Beaumont and warned him very particularly to stay within it whatever happened. And when this was done, there was nothing to do but wait and pray that the night would go as quietly as the night before. We scarcely talked at all, and by about 1 a.m. we were all very tense and nervous, so that at last Parsket got up and began to walk up and down the corridor to steady himself a bit. Presently I slipped off my pumps and joined him, and we walked up and down, whispering occasionally for something over an hour, until in turning I caught my foot in the bell cord and went down on my face, but without hurting myself or making a noise. When I got up, Parsket nudged me. "Did you notice the bell never rang?" he whispered. "Jove!" I said. "You're right." "Wait a minute," he answered. "I'll bet it's only a kink somewhere in the cord." He left his gun and slipped along the passage, and taking the top lamp tiptoed away into the house, carrying Beaumont's revolver ready in his right hand. He was a plucky chap, as I remember thinking then, and again later. Just then, Beaumont motioned to me for absolute quiet. Directly afterwards I heard the thing for which he listened, the sound of a horse galloping out in the night. I think that I may say I fairly shivered. The sound died away and left a horrible, desolate, eerie feeling in the air, I put my hand out to the bell cord, hoping that Parsket had got it clear. Then I waited, glancing before and behind. Perhaps 2 minutes passed, full of what seemed like an almost unearthly quiet. And then, suddenly down the corridor, at the lighted end, there sounded the clumping of a great hoof, and instantly the lamp was thrown down with a tremendous crash, and we were in the dark. I tugged hard on the cord and blew the whistle. Then I raised my snapshot and fired the flashlight. The corridor blazed into brilliant light, but there was nothing, and then the darkness fell like thunder. I heard the captain at the bedroom door and shouted to him to bring out a lamp, quick, but instead something started to kick the door, and I heard the captain shouting within the bedroom, and then the screaming of the women. I had a sudden, horrible fear that the monster had got into the bedroom, but in the same instant, from up the corridor, there came abruptly the vile, gobbling neighing that we had heard in the park and the cellar. I blew the whistle again, and groped blindly for the bell cord, shouting to Beaumont to stay in the pentacle, whatever happened. I yelled again to the captain to bring out a lamp, and there came a smashing sound against the bedroom door. Then I had my matches in my hand to get some light before that incredible, unseen monster was upon us. The match scraped on the box and flared up dully, and in the same instant I heard a faint sound behind me. I whipped round in a kind of mad terror and saw something in the light of the match, a monstrous horse head close to Beaumont. "Look out, Beaumont!" I shouted in a sort of scream. "It's behind you!" The match went out abruptly, and instantly there came the huge bang of Parsket's double barrel, both barrels at once, fired evidently single-handed by Beaumont close to my ear as it seemed. I caught a momentary glimpse of the great head in the flash, and of an enormous hoof amid the belch of fire and smoke seeming to be descending upon Beaumont. In the same instant I fired 3 chambers of my revolver. There was the sound of a dull blow, and then that horrible gobbling neigh broke out close to me. I fired twice at the sound. Immediately afterwards something struck me, and I was knocked backwards. I got onto my knees and shouted for help at the top of my voice. I heard the women screaming behind the closed door of the bedroom, and was dully aware that the door was being smashed from the inside, and directly afterwards I knew that Beaumont was struggling with some hideous thing near to me. For an instant I held back stupidly, paralysed with funk, and then, blindly and in a sort of rigid chill of goose-flesh, I went to help him, shouting his name. I can tell you I was nearly sick with the naked fear I had on me. There came a little choking scream out of the darkness, and at that I jumped forward into the dark. I gripped a vast, furry ear. Then something struck me another great blow, knocking me sick. I hit back, weak and blind, and gripped with my other hand at the incredible thing. Abruptly I was dimly aware of a tremendous crash behind me, and a great burst of light. There were other lights in the passage, and a noise of feet and shouting. My hand grips were torn from the thing they held. I shut my eyes, stupidly, and heard a loud yell above me, and then a heavy blow like a butcher chopping meat, and then something fell upon me. I was helped to my knees by the captain and the butler. On the floor lay an enormous horse head, out of which protruded a man's trunk and legs. On the wrists were fixed great hoofs. It was the monster. The captain cut something with the sword that he held in his hand, and stooped and lifted off the mask, for that is what it was. I saw the face of the man who had worn it. It was Parsket. He had a bad wound across the forehead where the captain's sword had bit through the mask. I looked bewilderedly from him to Beaumont, who was sitting up, leaning against the wall of the corridor. Then I stared at Parsket again. "By Jove!" I said at last. And then I was quiet, for I was so ashamed for the man. You can understand, can't you? He was opening his eyes, and you know, I had grown so to like him. And then, you know, just as Parsket was getting back his wits and looking from one to the other of us, and beginning to remember, there happened a strange and incredible thing. For from the end of the corridor there sounded suddenly the clumping of a great hoof. I looked that way, and then instantly at Parsket, and saw a horrible fear in his face and eyes. He wrenched himself round weakly and stared in mad terror up the corridor to where the sound had been, and the rest of us stared in a frozen group. I remember hearing vaguely half sobs and whispers from Miss Hisgins' bedroom, all the while that I stared frightenedly up the corridor. The silence lasted several seconds, and then, abruptly, there came again the clumping of the great hoof away at the end of the corridor, and immediately afterwards the clunk, 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 clunk of mighty hoofs coming down the passage towards us. Even then, you know, most of us thought it was some mechanism of Parsket still at work, and we were in the queerest mixture of fright and doubt. I think everyone looked at Parsket, and suddenly the captain shouted out, "Stop this damned fooling at once! Haven't you done enough?" For my part, I was now frightened, for I had a sense that there was something horrible and wrong. And then Parsket managed to gasp out, "It's not me! My God, it's not me! My God, it's not me!" And then, you know, it seemed to come home to everyone in an instant that there was really some dreadful thing coming down the passage. There was a mad rush to get away, and even old Captain Hisgins gave back with the butler and the footman. Beaumont fainted outright, as I found afterwards, for he had been badly mauled. I just flattened back against the wall, kneeling, as I was too stupid and dazed even to run. And almost in the same instant the ponderous hoof-falls sounded close to me, and seeming to shake the solid floor as they passed. Abruptly the great sounds ceased, and I knew in a sort of sick fashion that the thing had halted opposite to the open door of the girl's bedroom. And then I was aware that Parsket was standing rocking in the doorway, with his arms spread across it so as to fill the doorway with his body. I saw with less bewilderment. Parsket was extraordinarily pale, and the blood was running down his face from the wound in his forehead, and then I noticed that he seemed to be looking at something in the passage, with a peculiar, desperate, fixed, incredibly masterful gaze. But there was really nothing to be seen, and suddenly the clunk, 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 clunk recommenced, and passed onwards down the passage. In the same moment Parsket pitched forward out of the doorway onto his face. There were shouts from the huddle of men down the passage, and the 2 footmen and the butler simply ran, carrying their lanterns. But the captain went against the side wall with his back, and put the lamp he was carrying over his head. The dull tread of the horse went past him and left him unharmed, and I heard the monstrous hoof-falls going away and away through the quiet house. And after that, a dead silence. Then the captain moved and came towards us, very slow and shaky, with an extraordinarily grey face. I crept towards Parsket, and the captain came to help me. We turned him over, and you know, I knew in a moment that he was dead, but you can imagine what a feeling it sent through me. I looked up at the captain, and suddenly he said, That, and I know that he was trying to tell me that Parsket had stood between his daughter and whatever it was that had gone down the passage. I stood up and steadied him, though I was not very steady myself, and suddenly his face began to work, and he went down onto his knees by Parsket and cried like some shaken child. Then the women came out of the doorway of the bedroom, and I turned away and left him to them, whilst I went over to Beaumont. That is practically the whole story, and the only thing that is left to me is to try to explain some of the puzzling parts here and there. Perhaps you have seen that Parsket was in love with Miss Hisgins, and this fact is key to a good deal that was extraordinary. He was doubtless responsible for some portions of the haunting, in fact I think for nearly everything. But, you know, I can prove nothing, and what I have to tell you is chiefly the result of deduction. In the first place, it is obvious that Parsket's intention was to frighten Beaumont away, and when he found that he could not do this, I think he grew so desperate that he really intended to kill him. I hate to say this, but the facts force me to think so. I am quite certain that it was Parsket who broke Beaumont's arm. He knew all the details of the so-called horse legend, and got the idea to work upon the old story for his own end. He evidently had some method of slipping in and out of the house, probably through one of the many French windows, or possibly he had a key to one or two of the garden doors. And when he was supposed to be away, he was really coming down on the quiet and hiding somewhere in the neighbourhood. The incident of the kiss in the dark hall I put down to sheer nervous imaginings on the part of Beaumont and Miss Hisgins. Yet I must say that the sound of the horse outside of the front door is a little difficult to explain away. But I am still inclined to keep to my first idea on this point, that there was nothing really unnatural about it. The hoof sounds in the billiard room and down the passage were done by Parsket from the floor below by pumping up against the panelled ceiling with a block of wood tied to one of the window hooks. I proved this by an examination which showed the dints in the woodwork. The sounds of the horse galloping round the house were possibly made also by Parsket, who must have had a horse tied up in the plantation nearby, unless, indeed, he made the sounds himself. But I do not see how he could have gone fast enough to produce the illusion. In any case, I don't feel perfect certainty on this point. I failed to find any hoof marks, as you remember. The gobbling neighing in the park was a ventriloquial achievement on the part of Parsket, and the attack out there on Beaumont was also by him, so that when I thought he was in his bedroom, he must have been outside all the time, and joined me after I ran out the front door. This is almost probable. I mean that Parsket was the cause, for if it had been something more serious, he would certainly have given up his foolishness, knowing that there was no longer any need for it. I cannot imagine how he escaped being shot both then and in the last mad action of which I have just told you. He was enormously without fear of any kind for himself, as you can see. The time when Parsket was with us, when we thought we heard the horse galloping round the house, we must have been deceived. No one was very sure, except, of course, Parsket, who would naturally encourage the belief. The neighing in the cellar is where I consider there came the first suspicion into Parsket's mind that there was something more at work than his sham haunting. The neighing was done by him, in the same way that he did in the park, but when I remember how ghastly he looks, I feel sure that the sounds must have had some infernal quality added to them, which frightened the man himself. Yet later he would persuade himself that he had been getting fanciful. Of course, I must not forget that the effect upon Miss Hisgins must have made him feel pretty miserable. Then, about the clergyman being called away, we found afterwards that it was a bogus errand, or rather, call, and it is apparent that Parsket was at the bottom of this, so as to get a few more hours in which to achieve his end. And what that was, a very little imagination will show you, for he has found that Beaumont would not be frightened away. I hate to think of this, but I'm bound to. Anyway, it is obvious that the man was temporarily a bit off his normal balance. Love's a queer disease. Then, there is no doubt at all but that Parsket left the cord to the butler's bell hitched somewhere so as to give him an excuse to slip away, naturally to clear it. This also gave him the opportunity to remove one of the passage lamps. Then he had only to smash the other, and the passage was in utter darkness for him to make the attempt on Beaumont. In the same way, it was he who locked the door of the bedroom and took the key. It was in his pocket. This prevented the captain from bringing a light and coming to the rescue, but Captain Hisgins broke down the door with a heavy fender curb, and it was his smashing the door that sounded so confusing and frightening in the darkness of the passage. The photograph of the monstrous hoof above Miss Hisgins in the cellar is one of the things that I am less sure about. It might have been faked by Parsket whilst I was out of the room, and this would have been easy enough to anyone who knew how. But, you know, it does not look like a fake. Yet, there is as much evidence of probability that it was faked as against, and the thing is too vague for an examination to help to a definite decision, so that I will express no opinion one way or the other. It is certainly a horrible photograph. And now I come to the last dreadful thing. There has been no further manifestation of anything abnormal, so that there is an extraordinary uncertainty in my conclusions. If we had not heard those last sounds, and if Parsket had not shown that enormous sense of fear, the whole of the case could be explained in the way in which I have shown. And, in fact, as you have seen, I am of the opinion that almost all of it can be cleared up. But I see no way of going past the thing we heard in the last, and the fear that Parsket showed. His death. No, that proves nothing. At the inquest it was described somewhat untechnically as due to a heart spasm. That is normal enough and leaves us quite in the dark as to whether he died because he stood between the girl and some incredible thing of monstrosity. The look on Parsket's face, and the thing he called out when he heard the great hoof sounds coming down the passage, seemed to show that he had the sudden realization of what before then may have been nothing more than a horrible suspicion. And his fear and appreciation of some tremendous danger approaching was probably more keenly real even than mine. And then he did the one fine, great thing. "And the cause?" I said. "What caused it?" Karnaki shook his head. "God knows," he answered, with a peculiar, sincere reverence. "If that thing was what it seemed to be, one might suggest an explanation, which would not offend one's reason, but which may be utterly wrong. Yet I have thought, though it would take a long lecture on thought induction to get you to appreciate my reasons, that Parsket had produced what I might term a kind of induced haunting, a kind of induced simulation of his mental conceptions due to his desperate thoughts and broodings. It is impossible to make it clearer in a few words." "But the old story," I said. "Why may not there have been something in that?" "There may have been something in it," said Karnaki, "but I do not think that it had anything to do with this. I have not clearly thought out my reasons yet, but later I may be able to tell you why I think so." "And the marriage, and the cellar, was there anything found there?" asked Taylor. "Yes, the marriage was performed that day in spite of the tragedy," Karnaki told us. "It was the wisest thing to do, considering the things that I cannot explain. Yes, I had the floor of that big cellar up, for I had a feeling I might find something there to give me some light. But there was nothing. You know, the whole thing is tremendous and extraordinary. I shall never forget the look on Parsket's face, and afterwards the disgusting sounds of those great hoofs going away through the quiet house." Karnaki stood up. "Out you go," he said in friendly fashion, using the recognized formula. And we went presently out into the quiet of the embankment, and so to our homes. And that concludes the tale of the Horse of the Invisible, and where we shall take a break. But before we do that, I have Ray Tracer to thank for the resub. Thank you for the 16 months. A good time zone to you. Good to see you. I hope you're well. And Longest Dave with the raid. Dave, hello, welcome. I hope that you had a good and successful time with the Stumble Chums and the other games that you were doing. I was there for a little bit of it. Thank you, Raiders, for coming in. I'm sure Dave has given us a lovely introduction before you got here, but in case you didn't get any of that, my name is Sam. I read books here with Lahumph, who also goes by Lucy, as that is her name. We read books, short stories, longer stories. We take it in turns, alternating between who does what. Generally older public domain, out of copyright stuff. We feel better as people doing that, like we're not ripping off authors who stand to profit from their work. And yeah, this is what we do twice a week. We do also once a month like a little podcasty kind of stream where we show our faces and talk about things, usually media literacy, but sometimes other stuff. It's what we know best. And then we play a game, which currently we are working through Scarlet Hollow. We decided we'll try and make it sort of a text-heavy game, something we can still read, as is what we do here. But yeah, thank you for coming over and stopping in. If you're not following the channel, we'd love to have you. No pressure. Dave told us to dog-ear all the books pages and chew the covers. Joke's on you, Amorous. If you can find one that isn't, you're welcome to it. But yeah. That concludes The Horse of the Invisible. I will take us to a break because that went on long, but I feel like there are talking points about that one that we can do after the break before we go on to the next story. So go do break-related things. Get up, move around, stretch, cycle those fluids and those limbs, and see you back here in like 5 minutes or so, friends. Bye for now. Out you go. we are back. Hello, welcome back. So yeah, as you know, has been remarked upon, that was quite a Scooby-Doo one, that one, and like, I don't know if it came across. There were a couple of times I almost corpsed, and I don't know why. I don't know if it's just a me thing, but kind of the concept of being haunted by a malevolent spectral horse is to me a very naturally comical premise. Just this vengeful steed just like furiously charging down the hallways of a stately home. Like I appreciate that this isn't me saying, oh yeah, I think it'd be funny to be run down by a horse. No, obviously not. The horse ghost was very funny, yes, okay, good. Like, that's the thing. Horses will kill you 10 different ways. Like, in any direction a horse can, like, put you to an end. But, like, I don't know. And unfortunately, the other thought that popped into my head, and I realise that the more I talk about this, the longer I delay going on to the next story. The other thought that popped into my head while reading it this time, not in the past, I don't know why it pops up now, was that because apparently when you're reading you have a lot of time to think. You know how, like, a lot of stories get, stories get adapted, stories get, like, televised, made into things, and so it's like, sure, we've got looks at desk, Jekyll and Hyde, but what if Jekyll and Hyde were a modern story? How would that play out today? How would we adapt that, where everyone's got cell phones, and, and it's like, what if Dr. Jekyll wasn't just like a scientist working in his home, but he worked for like a pharmaceutical, and you get like the modern adaptation of a classic tale. And what popped into my head for this was, what if there's like a big budget televised adaptation of this, but instead of a horse it's a car, and just this image of like this, being haunted by some spectral car that's like revving its engine and charging down I don't know, that's just where my head went, and I found it very funny, and I nearly burst out laughing in the middle of the story. Stephen King was indeed into it. Yeah, exactly. Realising now, actually, no, that's literally been done. Yes, you are quite right. And, yeah. Or the other one. Oh, there's another one as well. Is it The Duel? Or something, like a guy who's just being haunted by a truck that just keeps like appearing behind him. And I've only seen a bit of it, but I just remember him being like the protagonist, the guy who's being harassed, just saying, "You miserable meathead." Like that's how he chooses to insult the driver who is basically harassing him. Yeah. Stephen King has made literally every object and creature haunted at some point, though. Yeah, exactly. Like he's kind of cornered that market just by sheer volume. But Christine, to be fair, was also very silly. Good. I am glad that this thesis plays out. Tested and approved by the board. Thank you. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm sort of picturing like the same again, like stately home, people dressed in sort of period appropriate garb, and there's just like a Mustang down the end revving its engine to come at you, and yeah. But anyway, good. I'm glad we all agree that it is kind of a funny premise for a story, and yes, a little bit Scooby-Doo. Doesn't make it a bad story, but it's just a little bit funny, and that's okay. I don't think Hodgson intended it to be funny. I'm sure at the time, it's a horse charging at you is sort of the same as a Chelsea tractor coming at you, but different eras and stuff. Mustang, good choice, thank you. I was playing for it. But yeah, I just lost my page. No, there we go. Right. This next story, and I'm going to drop the text in chat before anyone feels the need to ask. Boom, there you go. I will also pin it because it helps. This one is called The Derelict, and it is more back on what we know Hodgson for, spooky nautical stories. SpongeBob SquarePants, best of all the animals. And so, yeah, because it's now half past 10, and this one's probably going to be about as long as the last. We're going to be here for a while. I hope that's okay with everybody. And my voice. I'm going to spend tomorrow not talking to anyone. Let us continue with The Derelict, also by William Hope Hodgson. "It's the material," said the old ship's doctor. "The material, plus the conditions, and maybe," he added slowly, "a third factor. Yes, a third factor, but there. He broke off his half-meditative sentence and began to charge his pipe. "Go on, Doctor," we said encouragingly, and with more than a little expectancy. We were in the smoke-room of the Sandalee, running across the North Atlantic, and the Doctor was a character. He concluded the charging of his pipe and lit it, then settled himself and began to express himself more fully. "The material," he said with conviction, "is inevitably the medium of expression of the life force, the fulcrum, as it were, lacking which it is unable to exert itself, or, indeed, to express itself in any form or fashion that would be intelligible or evident to us. So potent is the share of the material in the production of that thing which we name life, and so eager the life force to express itself, that I am convinced it would, if given the right conditions, make itself manifest even through so hopeless seeming a medium as a simple block of sawn wood. For I tell you, gentlemen, the life force is both as fiercely urgent and as indiscriminate as fire, the destructor, yet which some are now grown to consider the very essence of life rampant. There is a quaint seeming paradox there," he concluded, nodding his old grey head. "Yes, Doctor," I said. "In brief, your argument is that life is a thing, state, fact, or element, call it what you like, which requires the material through which to manifest itself, and that given the material, plus the conditions, the result is life. In other words, that life is an evolved product, manifested through matter and bred of conditions, eh?" "As we understand the word," said the old doctor, "though, mind you, there may be a third factor. But in my heart I believe that it is a matter of chemistry. Conditions, and a suitable medium. But given the conditions, the brute is so almighty that it will seize upon anything through which to manifest itself. It is a force generated by conditions. But nevertheless, this does not bring us one iota nearer to an explanation, any more than out to the explanation of electricity or fire. They are, all three of the outer forces, monsters of the void. Nothing we can do will create any one of them. Our power is merely to be able, by providing the conditions, to make each one of them manifest to our physical senses. Am I clear?" "Yes, Doctor, in a way you are," I said, "but I don't agree with you, though I think I understand you. Electricity and fire are both what I might call natural things, but life is an abstract something, a kind of all-permeating wakefulness. I can't explain it, who could? But it's spiritual, not just a thing bred out of a condition, like fire, as you say, or electricity. It's a horrible thought of yours. Life's a kind of spiritual mystery." "Easy, my boy," said the old doctor, laughing gently to himself. "Or else I may be able to or else I may be asking you to demonstrate the spiritual mystery of life at the limpet, or the crab, shall we say?" He grinned at me with ineffable perverseness. "Anyway," he continued, "as I suppose you've all guessed, I've a yarn to tell you in support of my impression that life is no more a mystery or a miracle than fire or electricity. But please to remember, gentlemen, that because we've succeeded in naming and making good use of these two forces, they're just as much mysteries, fundamentally, as ever. And anyway, the thing I'm going to tell you won't explain the mystery of life, but only give you one of my pegs on which I hang my feelings that life is, as I have said, a force made manifest through conditions, that is to say, natural chemistry, and that it can take for its purpose and need the most incredible and unlikely matter, for without matter it cannot come into existence. It cannot become manifest." "I don't agree with you, Doctor," I interrupted. "Your theory would destroy all belief in life after death. It would—" "Hush, sonny," said the old man, with a quiet little smile of comprehension. "Hark to what I've to say first, and anyway, what objection do you have to material life after death? And if you object to a material framework, I would still have you remember that I am speaking of life as we understand the word in this, our life. Now, do be a quiet lad, or I'll never be done. When I was a young man, and that is a good many years ago, gentlemen, I had passed my examinations, but was so run down with overwork that it was decided that I had better take a trip to sea. I was by no means well off, and very glad, in the end, to secure a nominal post as doctor in a sailing passenger clipper running out to China. The name of the ship was the Bopti, and soon after I had got all my gear aboard she cast off, and we dropped down the Thames, and next day we were well out in the Channel. The captain's name was Gannington, a very decent man, though quite illiterate. The first mate, Mr. Burleys, was a quiet, sternish, reserved man, very well read. The second mate, Mr. Selvin, was perhaps by birth and upbringing the most socially cultured of the three, but he lacked the stamina and indomitable pluck of the two others. He was more of a sensitive and emotionally and even mentally the most alert man out of the three. On our way out, we called at Madagascar, where we landed some of our passengers. Then we ran eastward, meaning to call at Northwest Cape. But about 100 degrees east we encountered very dreadful weather, which carried away all our sails and sprung the jibboom and fore-gallant mast. The storm carried us northward for several hundred miles, and when it dropped us finally, we found ourselves in a very bad state. The ship had been strained, and had taken some 3 feet of water through her seams. The main topmast had been sprung, in addition to the jibboom and fore-gallant mast. 2 of our boats had gone, as also one of the pigsties, with 3 fine pigs, this latter having been washed overboard but some half-hour before the wind began to ease, which it did quickly, though a very ugly sea ran for some hours after. The wind left us just before dark, and when morning came it brought splendid weather, a calm, mildly undulating sea and a brilliant sun with no wind. It showed us also that we were not alone. For about 2 miles away to the westward was another vessel, which Mr. Selvin, the second mate, pointed out to me. "That's a pretty rum-looking packet, Doctor," he said, and handed me his glass. I looked through it at the other vessel and saw what he meant. At least, I thought I did. "Yes, Mr. Selvin," I said. "She's got a pretty old-fashioned look about her." He laughed at me, in his pleasant way. "It's easy to see you're not a sailor, Doctor," he remarked. "There's a dozen rum things about her. She's a derelict, and has been floating round, by the look of her, for many a score of years. Look at the shape of her counter, and the bows of the cutwater. She's as old as the hills, as you might say, and ought to have gone down to Davy Jones a long time ago. Look at the growths on her, and the thickness of her standing rigging. That's all salt incrustations, I fancy, if you notice the white colour. She's been a small bark, but don't you see she's not a yard left aloft? They've all dropped out of the slings, everything rotted away. Wonder the standing rigging hasn't gone too. I wish the old man would let us take a boat and have a look at her. She'd be well worth it." There seemed little chance, however, of this, for all hands were turned to and kept hard at it all day long, repairing the damage to the masts and gear, and this took a long while, as you may think. Part of the time I gave a hand heaving on one of the deck capstans, for the exercise was good for my liver. Old Captain Gannington approved, and I persuaded him to come along and try some of the same medicine, which he did, and we grew very chummy over the job. We got talking about the derelict, and he remarked how lucky we were not to have run full tilt onto her in the darkness, for she lay right away to leeward of us, according to the way that we had been drifting in the storm. He also was of the opinion that she had a strange look about her, and that she was pretty old, but on this latter point he plainly had far less knowledge than the second mate, for he was, as I have said, an illiterate man, and knew nothing of the seacraft, beyond what experience had taught him. He lacked the book knowledge which the second mate had of vessels previous to his day, which it appeared the derelict was. "She's an old 'un, Doctor," was the extent of his observations in this direction. Yet, when I mentioned to him that it would be interesting to go aboard and give her a bit of an overhaul, he nodded his head as if the idea had been already in his mind, and accorded with his own inclinations. "When the work's over, Doctor," he said. "Can't spare the men now, you know. Got to get all shipshape and ready as smart as we can. But we'll take my gig and go off on the second dog watch. The glass is steady and it'll be a bit of gam for us." That evening, after tea, the captain gave orders to clear the gig and get her overboard. The second mate was to come with us, and the skipper gave him word to see that 2 or 3 lamps were put into the boat, as it would soon fall dark. A little later we were pulling across the calmness of the sea with a crew of 6 at the oars and making very good speed of it. Now, gentlemen, I have detailed to you with great exactness all the facts, both big and little, so that you can follow step by step each incident in this extraordinary affair, and I want you now to pay the closest attention. I was sitting in the stern sheets with the second mate and the captain, who was steering, and as we drew nearer and nearer to the stranger, I studied her with an ever-growing attention, as, indeed, did Captain Gannington and the second mate. She was, as you know, to the westward of us, and the sunset was making a great flame of red light to the back of her, so that she showed a little blurred and indistinct by reason of the halation of the light, which almost defeated the eye in any attempt to see her rotting spars and standing rigging submerged as they were in the fiery glory of the sunset. It was because of this effect of the sunset that we had come quite close, comparatively, to the derelict before we saw that she was all surrounded by a sort of curious scum, the colour of which was difficult to decide upon, by reason of the red light that was in the atmosphere, but which afterwards we discovered to be brown. This scum spread all about the old vessel for many hundreds of yards, in a huge, irregular patch, a great stretch of which reached out to the eastward upon our starboard side, some 100 or so fathoms away. "Queer stuff," said Captain Gannington, leading to the side and looking over. "Something in the cargo has gone rotten and worked out through her seams." "Look at her bows and stern," said the second mate. "Just look at the growth on her." There were, as he had said, great clumpings of strange-looking sea fungi under the bows and the short counter astern. From the stump of her jibboom and her cutwater, great beards of rime and marine growths hung downward into the scum that held her in. Her blank starboard side was presented to us, all a dead, dirtyish white, streaks and mottled vaguely with dull masses of heavier colour. "There's a steam of haze rising off her," said the second mate, speaking again. "You can see it against the light. It keeps coming and going, look." I saw then what he meant. A faint haze or steam either suspended above the old vessel or rising from her, and Captain Gannington saw it also. "Spontaneous combustion," he exclaimed. "We'll have to watch when we lift off the hatches unless some poor devil's that's got aboard of her, unless it's some poor devil that's got aboard of her. But that ain't likely." We were now within a couple of yards of the old derelict and had entered into the brown scum. As it poured off the lifted oars, I heard one of the men mutter to himself, "Damn treacle!" And, indeed, it was something like it. As the boat continued to forge nearer and nearer to the old ship, the scum grew thicker and thicker, so that, at last, it perceptibly slowed us. "Give way, lads! Put some beef into it!" sung out Captain Gannington, and thereafter there was no sound, except the panting of the men and the faint, reiterated suck of the sullen brown scum upon the oars, as the boat was forced ahead. As we went, I was conscious of a peculiar smell in the evening air, and whilst I had no doubt that the puddling of the scum by the oars made it rise, I felt that in some way it was vaguely familiar, yet I could give it no name. We were now very close to the old vessel, and presently she was high above us, against the dying light. The captain called out then to "in with the bow-oars and stand by with the boat-hook," which was done. "Aboard there, ahoy! Aboard there, ahoy!" shouted Captain Gannington, but there came no answer, only the flat sound of his voice going lost into the open sea each time he sung out. "Ahoy! Aboard there, ahoy!" he shouted time after time. but there was only the weary silence of the old hulk that answered us, and somehow, as he shouted, the while that I stared up half expectantly at her, a queer little sense of oppression that amounted almost to nervousness came upon me. It passed, but I remember how I was suddenly aware that it was growing dark. Darkness comes fairly rapidly in the tropics, though not so quickly as many fiction writers seem to think, but it was not that the coming dusk had perceptibly deepened in that brief time, of only a few moments, but rather that my nerves had made me suddenly a little hypersensitive. I mention my state particularly, for I am not a nervy man normally, and my abrupt touch of nerves is significant in the light of what happened. "There's no one aboard there," said Captain Gannington. "Give way, men!" For the boat's crew had instinctively rested on their oars as the captain hailed the old craft. The man gave way again, and then the second mate called out excitedly, "Why, look, there's our pigsty! See, it's got Biopti painted on the end. It's drifted down here and the scum's caught it. What a blessed wonder!" It was, as he had said, our pigsty that had been washed overboard in the storm, and most extraordinary to come across it there. "We'll tow it off with us when we go," remarked the captain, and shouted to the crew to get down to their oars, for they were hardly moving the boat, because the scum was so thick, close in around the old ship, that it literally clogged the boat from going ahead. I remember that it struck me, in a half-conscious sort of way, as curious that the pigsty, containing our 3 dead pigs, had managed to drift in so far, unaided, whilst we could scarcely manage to force the boat in, now that we had come right into the scum. But the thought passed from my mind, for so many things happened within the next few minutes. The men managed to bring the boat in alongside, within a couple of feet of the derelict, and the man with the boat hook hooked on. "Have you got all there, for'ard?" asked Captain Gannington. "Yes, sir," said the bowman as he spoke. As he spoke, there came a queer noise of tearing. "What's that?" asked the captain. "It's tore, sir, tore clean away," said the man, and his tone showed that he had received something of a shock. "Get a hold again, then," said Captain Gannington irritably. "You don't suppose this packet was built yesterday? Shove the hook into the main chains." The man did so, gingerly, as you might say, for it seemed to me, in the growing dusk, that he put no strain onto the hook, though of course there was no need. You see, the boat could not go very far of herself in the stuff in which she was embedded. I remember thinking this, also, as I looked up at the bulging side of the old vessel. Then I heard Captain Gannington's voice. "Lord, but she's old. And what a colour, Doctor. She don't half want paint, do she? Now then, somebody, one of them oars." An oar was passed to him, and he leant it up against the ancient bulging side. Then he paused and called to the second mate to light a couple of the lamps, and stand by to pass them up, for darkness had settled down now upon the sea. The second mate lit 2 of the lamps, and told one of the men to light a third and keep it handy in the boat. Then he stepped across with a lamp in each hand to where Captain Gannington stood by the oar against the side of the ship. "Now, my lad," said the captain to the mate who had pulled stroke, "up with you and I'll pass you up the lamps." The man jumped to obey, caught the oar and put his weight upon it, and as he did so something seemed to give a little. "Look!" cried out the second mate, and pointed lamp in hand. "It's sunk in." This was true. The oar had made quite an indentation into the bulging, somewhat slimy side of the old vessel. "Mould, I reckon," said Captain Gannington, bending towards the derelicts to look. Then to the man, "Up you go, my lad, and be smart. Don't stand there waiting." At that, the man, who had paused a moment as he felt the oar give beneath his weight, began to shin up, and in a few seconds he was aboard and leant out over the rail for the lamps. These were passed up to him, and the captain called to him to steady the oar. Then Captain Gannington went, calling to me to follow, and after me the second mate. As the captain put his face over the rail, he gave a cry of astonishment. "Mould, by gum! Mould, tons of it! Good Lord! As I heard him shout that, I scrambled the more eagerly after him, and in a moment or two I was able to see what he meant. Everywhere that the light from the 2 lamps struck, there was nothing but smooth, great masses and surfaces of a dirty white mould. I climbed over the rail with the second mate close behind and stood upon the mould-covered decks. There might have been no planking beneath the mould, for all that our feet could feel. It gave under our tread with a spongy, puddingy feel. It covered the deck furniture of the old ship, so that the shape of each article and fitment was often no more than suggested through it. Captain Gannington snatched a lamp from the man, and the second mate reached for the other. They held the lamps high, and we all stared. It was most extraordinary, and somehow most abominable. I can think of no other word, gentlemen, that so much describes the predominant feeling that affected me at that moment. "Good Lord!" said Captain Gannington several times. "Good Lord!" But neither the second mate nor the man said anything, and for my part I just stared, and at the same time began to smell a little at the air, for there was again a vague odour of something half familiar that somehow brought to me a sense of half-known fright. I turned this way and that, staring, as I have said. Here and there the mould was so heavy as to entirely disguise what lay beneath, converting the deck fittings into indistinguishable mounds of mould, all dirty white and blotched and veined with irregular, dull purplish markings. There was a strange thing about the mould which Captain Gannington drew attention to. It was that our feet did not crush into it and break the surface as might have been expected, but merely indented it. "Never seen nothing like it before. Never," said the captain, after having stooped with his lamp to examine the mould under our feet. He stamped with his heel, and the stuff gave out a dull, puddingy sound. He stooped again with a quick movement and stared, holding the lamp close to the deck. "Blessed if it ain't a regular skin to it," he said. The second mate and the man and I all stooped and looked at it. The second mate progged it with his forefinger, and I remember I rapped it several times with my knuckles, listening to the dead sound it gave out, and noticing the close, firm texture of the mould. "Dough," said the second mate. "It's just like blessed dough." "Whew!" He stood up with a movement. "I could fancy it stinks a bit," he said. As he said this, I knew suddenly what the familiar thing was in the vague odour that hung about us. It was that the smell had something animal-like in it. Something of the same smell, only heavier, that you will smell in any place that is infested with mice. I began to look about with a sudden, very real uneasiness. There might be vast numbers of hungry rats aboard. They might prove exceedingly dangerous, if in a starving condition. Yet, as you will understand, somehow I hesitated to put forward my idea as a reason for caution. It was too fanciful. Captain Gannington had begun to go aft along the mould-covered main deck with the second mate, each of them holding his lamp high up, so as to cast a good light about the vessel. I turned quickly and followed them, the man with me keeping close to my heels and plainly uneasy. As we went, I became aware that there was a feeling of moisture in the air, and I remember the slight mist or smoke above the hulk, which had made Captain Gannington suggest spontaneous combustion in explanation. And always, as we went, there was that vague animal smell, and suddenly I found myself wishing we were well away from the old vessel. Abruptly, after a few paces, the captain stopped and pointed at a row of mould-hidden shapes on either side of the main deck. "Guns," he said. "Been a privateer in the old days, I guess. Maybe worse. We'll have a look below, Doctor, and see if there may be something worth touching." She's older than I thought, Mr. Selvin. Sure, she's older than I thought. Mr. Selvin thinks she's about 300 years old, but I scarce think it." We continued our way aft, and I remember that I found myself walking as lightly and gingerly as possible, as if I were subconsciously afraid of treading through the rotten, mould-hid decks. I think the others had a touch of the same feeling from the way that they walked. Occasionally the soft mould would grip our heels, releasing them with a little sullen suck. The captain forged somewhat ahead of the second mate, and I know that the suggestion he had made himself, that perhaps there might be something below worth the carrying away, had stimulated his imagination. The second mate was, however, beginning to feel somewhat the same way that I did. At least, I have that impression. I think if it had not been for what I might truly describe as Captain Gannington's sturdy courage, we should all of us have just gone back over the side very soon, for there was most certainly an unwholesome feeling abroad that made one feel queerly lacking in pluck, and you will soon perceive that this feeling was justified. Just as the captain reached the few mould-covered steps leading up onto the short half-poop, I was suddenly aware that the feeling of moisture in the air had grown very much more definite. It was perceptible now, intermittently, as a sort of thin, moist, fog-like vapour that came and went oddly, and seemed to make the decks a little indistinct to the view this time and that. Once, an odd puff of it beat up suddenly from somewhere and caught me in the face, carrying a queer, sickly, heavy odour with it, that somehow frightened me strangely with a suggestion of awaiting and half-comprehended danger. We had followed Captain Gannington up the 3 mould-covered steps, and now went slowly aft along the raised afterdeck. By the mizzenmast, Captain Gannington paused and held his lantern near to it. "My word, mister," he said to the second mate, "it's fair thickened up with mould. Why, our gant here's close to 4 foot thick." He shone the light down to where it met the deck. "Good Lord," he said, "look at the sea lice on it." I stepped up, and it was as he had said. The sea lice were thick upon it, some of them huge, not less than the size of large beetles, and all a clear, colourless shade, like water, except where there were little spots of grey in them, evidently their internal organisms. I've never seen the like of 'em except on live cod," said Captain Gannington in an extremely puzzled voice. "My word, but they're whoppers." Then he passed on, but a few paces farther aft he stopped again and held his lamp near to the mould-hidden deck. "Lord bless me, Doctor," he called out in a low voice, "do you ever see the like of that? Why, it's a foot long if it's an inch." I stooped over his shoulder and saw what he meant. It was a clear, colourless creature about a foot long and about 8 inches high, with a curved back that was extraordinarily narrow. As we stared, all in a group, it gave a queer little flick, and was gone. "Jumped," said the captain. "Well, if that ain't a giant of all the sea lice that ever I've seen, I guess it's jumped 20 foot clear." He straightened his back and scratched his head a moment, swinging the lantern this way and that with the other hand, and staring about us. "What are they doing aboard here?" he said. "You'll see 'em, little things, on fat cod and such like. I'm blowed, Doctor, if I understand." He held his lamp towards a big mound of the mould that occupied part of the after portion of the low poop deck, a little foreside of where there came a 2-foot-high break to a kind of second and loftier poop that ran away aft to the taffrail. The mound was pretty big, several feet across, and more than a yard high. Captain Gannington walked up to it. "I reckon this is a scuttle," he remarked, and gave it a heavy kick. The only result was a deep indentation into a huge whitish hump of mould, as if he had driven his foot into a mass of some doughy substance. Yet I am not altogether correct in saying that this was the only result, for a certain thing happened. From a place made by the captain's foot there came a little gush of a purplish fluid, accompanied by a peculiar smell that was and was not half familiar. Some of the mould-like substance had stuck to the toe of the captain's boot, and from this likewise there issued a sweat, as it were, of the same colour. "Well," said Captain Gannington in surprise, and drew back his foot to make another kick at the hump of mould. But he paused at an exclamation from the second mate. "Don't, sir," said the second mate. I glanced at him, and the light from Captain Gannington's lamp showed me that his face had a bewildered, half-frightened look, as if he were suddenly and unexpectedly half afraid of something, and as if his tongue had given away his sudden fright without any intention on his part to speak. The captain also turned and stared at him. "Why, mister?" he asked in a somewhat puzzled voice, through which there sounded just the vaguest hint of annoyance. "We've got to shift this muck if we're to get below." I looked at the second mate, and it seemed to me that, curiously enough, he was listening less to the captain than to some other sound. Suddenly, he said, in a queer voice, "Listen, everybody!" Yet we heard nothing beyond the faint murmur of the men talking together in the boat alongside. "I don't hear nothing," said Captain Gannington after a short pause. "Do you, Doctor?" "No," I said. "What was it you thought you heard?" asked the captain, turning again to the second mate. But the second mate shook his head, in a curious, almost irritable way, as if the captain's question interrupted his listening. Captain Gannington stared a moment at him, then held his lantern up and glanced about him, almost uneasily. I know I felt a queer sense of strain, but the light showed nothing beyond the greyish, dirty white of the mould in all directions. "Mr. Selvin," said the captain, at last, looking at him, "don't get fancying things. Get a hold of your bloomin' self. You know you heard nothing?" "I'm quite sure I heard something, sir," said the second mate. "I seemed to hear—" He broke off sharply and appeared to listen with an almost painful intensity. "What did it sound like?" I asked. "It's all right, Doctor," said Captain Gannington, laughing gently. "You can give him a tonic when we get back. I'm going to shift this stuff." He drew back and kicked for a second time at the ugly mass, which he took to hide the companionway. The result of his kick was startling, for the whole thing wobbled sloppily like a mound of unhealthy-looking jelly. He drew his foot out of it quickly and took a step backward, staring and holding his lamp towards it. "By gum," he said, and it was plain that he was genuinely startled. "The blessed thing's gone soft." The man had run back several steps from the suddenly flaccid mound and looked horribly frightened, though of what I am sure he had not the least idea. The second mate stood where he was and stared. For my part, I know I had a most hideous uneasiness upon me. The captain continued to hold his light towards the wobbling mound and stare. "It's gone squashy all through," he said. "There's no scuttle there. There's no bally woodwork inside that lot. What a rum smell." He walked round to the after side of the strange mound to see whether there might be some signs of an opening into the hull at the back of the great heap of mould stuff, and then— "Listen," said the second mate again in the strangest sort of voice. Captain Gannington straightened himself upright, and there succeeded a pause of the most intense quietness, in which there was not even the hum of talk from the men alongside the boat. We all heard it. A kind of dull, soft thud, 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 thud somewhere in the hull under us, yet so vague that I might have been half doubtful I heard it, only that the others did so too. Captain Gannington turned suddenly to where the man stood. "Tell them," he began. But the fellow cried out something and pointed. There had come a strange intensity into his somewhat unemotional face, so that the captain's glance followed his action instantly. I stared, also, as you may think. It was the great mound at which the man was pointing. I saw what he meant. From the two gapes made in the mould-like stuff by Captain Gannington's boot, the purple fluid was jetting out in a queerly regular fashion, almost as if it were being forced out by a pump. My word! But I stared, and even as I stared a larger jet squirted out and splashed as far as the man, spattering his boots and trouser legs. The fellow had been pretty nervous before, in a stolid, ignorant sort of way, and his funk had been growing steadily. But at this, he simply let out a yell and turned about to run. He paused an instant, as if a sudden fear of the darkness that held the decks between him and the boat had taken him. He snatched at the second mate's lantern, tore it out of his hand, and plunged heavily away over the vile stretch of mould. Mr. Selvin, the second mate, said not a word. He was just standing, staring at the strange-smelling twin streams of dull purple that were jetting out from the wobbling mound. Captain Gannington, however, roared an order to the man to come back. But the man plunged on and on across the mould, his feet seeming to be clogged by the stuff, as if it had suddenly grown soft. He zigzagged as he ran, the lantern swaying in wild circles as he wrenched his feet free, with a constant plop, plop, and I could hear his frightened gasps, even from where I stood. "Come back with that lamp!" roared the captain again. But still the man took no notice, and Captain Gannington was silent an instant, his lips working in a queer, inarticulate fashion, as if he were stunned momentarily by the very violence of his anger at the man's insubordination. And in the silence I heard the sounds again. Thud, 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 quite distinctly now, beating, it seemed suddenly to me, right down under my feet, but deep. I stared down at the mould on which I was standing, with a quick, disgusting sense of the terrible all about me. Then I looked at the captain and tried to say something without appearing frightened. I saw that he had turned again to the mound, and all the anger had gone out of his face. He had his lamp out towards the mound and was listening. There was a further moment of absolute silence. At least I know that I was not conscious of any sound at all, in all the world, except that extraordinary thud, 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 down somewhere in the huge bulk under us. The captain shifted his feet with a sudden, nervous movement, and as he lifted them, the mould went plop, plop. He looked quickly at me, trying to smile, as if he were not thinking anything very much about it. "What do you make of it, Doctor?" he said. "I think," I began, but the second mate interrupted with a single word. His voice pitched a little high in a tone that made us both stare instantly at him. "Look!" he said, and pointed at the mound. The thing was all of a slow quiver. A strange ripple ran outward from it along the deck like you will see a ripple run inshore out of a calm sea. It reached a mound a little foreside of us, which I had supposed to be cabin skylight, and in a moment the second mound sank nearly level with the surrounding decks, quivering floppily in a most extraordinary fashion. A sudden, quick tremor took the mould, right under the second mate, and he gave out a hoarse little cry and held his arms out on each side of him to keep his balance. The tremor of the mould spread, and Captain Gannington swayed and spread his feet with a sudden curse of fright. The second mate jumped across him and caught him by the wrist. "The boat, sir," he said, saying the very thing that I had lacked the pluck to say. "For God's sake!" But he never finished, for a tremendous, hoarse scream cut off his words. They hove themselves round, and I looked. I could see without turning. The man who had run from us was standing in the waist of the ship, about a fathom from the starboard bulwarks. He was swaying from side to side and screaming in a dreadful fashion. He appeared to be trying to lift his feet, and the light from his swaying lantern showed an almost incredible sight. All about him the mould was in active movement. His feet had sunk out of sight. The stuff appeared to be lapping at his legs, and abruptly his bare flesh showed. The hideous stuff had rent his trouser legs away as if they were paper. He gave out a simply sickening scream, and, with a vast effort, wrenched one leg free. It was partly destroyed. The next instant he pitched face downward, and the stuff heaped itself upon him, as if it were actually alive, with a dreadful, savage life. It was simply infernal. The man had gone from sight. Where he had fallen was now a writhing, elongated mound, in constant and horrible increase as the mould appeared to move towards it in strange ripples from all sides. Captain Gannington and the second mate were stone silent in amazed and incredulous horror, but I had begun to reach towards a grotesque and terrific conclusion, both helped and hindered by my professional training. From the men in the boat alongside there was a loud shouting, and I saw two of their faces appear suddenly above the rail. They showed clearly a moment in the light from the lamp which the man had snatched from Mr. Selvin, for strangely enough this lamp was standing upright and unharmed on the deck, a little way foreside of that dreadful, elongated growing mound that still swayed and writhed with an incredible horror. The lamp rose and fell on the passing ripples of the mould, just for all the world as you will see a boat rise and fall on little swells. It is of some interest to me now, psychologically, to remember how that rising and falling lantern brought home to me, more than anything, the incomprehensible, dreadful strangeness of it all. The men's faces disappeared with sudden yells, as if they had slipped or been suddenly hurt, and there was a fresh uproar of shouting from the boat. The men were calling to us to come away, to come away. In the same instant I felt my left boot drawn suddenly and forcibly downward with a horrible, painful gripe. I wrenched it free with a yell of angry fear. Forward of us, I saw that the vile surface was all a-move, and abruptly I found myself shouting in a queer, frightened voice, "The boat, Captain! The boat, Captain!" Captain Gannington stared round at me over his right shoulder in a peculiar, dull way that told me he was utterly dazed with bewilderment at the incomprehensibleness of it all. I took a quick, clogged, nervous step towards him and gripped his arm and shook it fiercely. "The boat!" I shouted at him. "The boat! For God's sake, tell the men to bring the boat aft!" Then the mould must have drawn his feet down, for abruptly he bellowed fiercely with terror, his momentary apathy giving place to furious energy. His thick-set, vastly muscular body doubled and writhed with his enormous effort, and he struck out madly, dropping the lantern. He tore his feet free, something ripping as he did so. The reality and necessity of the situation had come upon him, brutishly real, and he was roaring at the men in the boat. "Bring the boat aft! Bring her aft! Bring her aft!" The second mate and I were shouting the same thing madly. "For God's sake, be smart, lads!" roared the captain, and stooped quickly for his lamp, which still burned. His feet were gripped again, and he hove them out, blaspheming breathlessly, and leaping a yard high with his effort. Then he made a run for the side, wrenching his feet free at each step. In the same instant the second mate cried out something, and grabbed at the captain. It's got a hold of my feet! It's got a hold of my feet!" he screamed. His feet had disappeared up to his boot-tops, and Captain Gannington caught him round the waist with his powerful left arm, gave a mighty heave, and the next instant had him free, but both his boot-soles had almost gone. For my part, I jumped madly from foot to foot to avoid the plucking of the mould, and suddenly I made a run for the ship's side. But before I could get there, a queer gape came in the mould, between us and the side, at least a couple of feet wide, and how deep I don't know. It closed up in an instant, and all the mould where the gape had been went into a sort of flurry of horrible ripplings, so that I ran back from it, for I did not dare put my foot upon it. Then the captain was shouting at me, "Aft, doctor! Aft, doctor! This way, doctor! Run!" I saw then that he had passed me, and was up on the after rail, raised portion of the poop. On the after raised portion of the poop. He had the second mate thrown like a sack, all loose and quiet, over his left shoulder. For Mr. Selvin had fainted, and his long legs flogged, limp and helpless against the captain's massive knees as the captain ran. I saw, with a queer, unconscious noting of minor details, how the torn soles of the second mate's boots flapped and jigged as the captain staggered aft. "Boat ahoy! Boat ahoy! Boat ahoy!" shouted the captain, and then I was beside him shouting also. The men were answering with loud yells of encouragement, and it was plain they were working desperately to force the boat aft, through the thick scum about the ship. We reached the ancient mould-hid taffrail, and slewed about breathlessly in the half-darkness to see what was happening. Captain Gannington had his left lantern by the big mound when he picked up the second mate. Had left his lantern by the big mound. When he picked up the second mate. As we stood, gasping, we discovered suddenly that all the mould between us and the light was full of movement. Yet the part on which we stood, for about 6 or 8 feet forward of us, was still firm. Every couple of seconds we shouted to the men to hasten, and they kept on calling to us that they would be with us in an instant. And all the time we watched the deck of that dreadful hulk, feeling, for my part, literally sick with mad suspense, and ready to jump overboard into that filthy scum all about us. Down somewhere in the huge bulk of the ship there was all the time that extraordinary, dull, ponderous thud, 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 thud growing ever louder. I seemed to feel the whole hull of the derelict beginning to quiver and thrill with each dull beat. And to me, with the grotesque and monstrous suspicion of what made that noise, it was at once the most dreadful and incredible sound I have ever heard. As we waited desperately for the boat, I scanned incessantly so much of the grey-white bulk as the lamp showed. The whole of the decks seemed to be in strange movement. Forward of the lamp I could see indistinctly the moundings of the mould swaying and nodding hideously behind the circle of the brightest rays. Nearer and full in the glow of the lamp, the mound which should have indicated the skylight was swelling steadily. There were ugly, purple veinings on it, and as it swelled it seemed to me that the veinings and mottlings on it were becoming plainer, rising as though embossed upon it, like you will see the veins stand out in the body of a powerful, full-blooded horse. It was most extraordinary. The mound that we had supposed to cover the companionway had sunk flat with the surrounding mould, and I could not see that it jetted out any more of the purplish fluid. A quaking movement of the mould began away forward of the lamp, and came flurrying away aft towards us, and at the sight of that I climbed up onto the spongy-feeling taffrail and yelled afresh for the boat. The men answered with a shout, which told me they were nearer, but the beastly scum was so thick that it was evidently a fight to move the boat at all. Beside me, Captain Gannington was shaking the second mate furiously, and the man stirred and began to moan. The captain shook him again. Wake up, mister!" he shouted. The second mate staggered out of the captain's arms and collapsed suddenly, shrieking, "My feet! Oh, God, my feet!" The captain and I lugged him up off the mould and got him into a sitting position upon the taffrail, where he kept up a continual moaning. "Hold him, doctor," said the captain, and whilst I did so he ran forward a few yards and peered down over the starboard quarter rail. "For God's sake, be smart, lads! Be smart! Be smart!" he shouted down to the men, and they answered him, breathless, from close at hand, yet still too far away for the boat to be any use to us on the instant. I was holding the moaning, half-unconscious officer and staring forward along the poop decks. The flurrying of the mould was coming aft, slowly and noiselessly, and then suddenly I saw something closer. "Look out, Captain!" I shouted, and even as I shouted, the mould near to him gave a sudden, peculiar slobber. I had seen a ripple stealing towards him through the horrible stuff. He gave an enormous, clumsy leap and landed near to us on the sound part of the mould, but the movement followed him. He turned and faced it, swearing fiercely. All about his feet there came abruptly little gapings which made horrid sucking noises. "Come back, Captain!" I yelled. "Come back, quick!" As I shouted, a ripple came at his feet, lipping at them, and he stamped insanely at it and leaped back, his boot torn half off at his foot. He swore madly with pain and anger and jumped swiftly for the taffrail. "Come on, doctor, over we go!" he called. Then he remembered the filthy scum and hesitated, roaring out desperately to the men to hurry. I stared down also. "The second mate?" I said. "I'll take charge, doctor," said Captain Gannington, and caught hold of Mr. Selvin. As he spoke, I thought I saw something beneath us outlined against the scum. I leaned out over the stern and peered. There was something under the port quarter. "There's something down there, Captain," I called and pointed in the darkness. He stooped far over and stared. "A boat! By gum, a boat!" he yelled and began to wriggle swiftly along the taffrail, dragging the second mate after him. I followed. "A boat it is, sure!" he exclaimed a few moments later, and picking up the second mate clear of the rail, he hove him down into the boat, where he fell with a crash into the bottom. "Over you go, doctor!" he yelled at me, and pulled me bodily off the rail and dropped me after the officer. As I did so, I felt the whole of the ancient spongy rail give a peculiar sickening quiver, and began to wobble. I fell onto the second mate, and the captain came after, almost in the same instant, but fortunately he landed clear of us, onto the fourthwart, which broke under his weight with a loud crack and splintering of wood. "Thank God," I heard him mutter. "Thank God! I guess that was a mighty near thing to going to hell." He struck a match just as I got to my feet, and between us we got the second mate straightened out on one of the afterthwarts. We shouted to the men in the boat, telling them where we were, and saw the light of their lanterns shining round the starboard counter of the Derelict. They called back to us to tell us they were doing their best, and then, whilst we waited, Captain Gannington struck another match and began to overhaul the boat we had dropped into. She was a modern two-bowed boat, and on the stern there was painted Cyclone Glasgow. She was in pretty fair condition and had evidently drifted into the scum and been held by it. Captain Gannington struck several matches and went forward towards the Derelict. Suddenly he called to me, and I jumped over the thwarts to him. "Look, Doctor," he said, and I saw what he meant. A mass of bones up in the bows of the boat. I stooped over them and looked. There were the bones of at least 3 people, all mixed together in an extraordinary fashion, and quite clean and dry. I had a sudden thought concerning the bones, but I said nothing, for my thought was vague in some ways and concerned the grotesque and incredible suggestion that had come to me as to the cause of that ponderous, dull thud, 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 thud that beat on so infernally within the hull, and was plain to hear even now that we had gone off the vessel herself. And all the while, you know, I had a sick, horrible mental picture of that frightful wriggling mound aboard the hulk. As Captain Gannington struck a final match, I saw something that sickened me, and the captain saw it in the same instant. The match went out, and he fumbled clumsily for another and struck it. We saw the thing again. We had not been mistaken. A great lip of grey-white was protruding over the edge of the boat. A great lappet of the mould was coming stealthily towards us, a live mass of the very hull itself. And suddenly Captain Gannington yelled out in so many words the grotesque and incredible thing I was thinking. "She's alive!" I never heard such a sound of comprehension and terror in a man's voice. The very horrified assurance of it made actual to me the thing that before had only lurked in my subconscious mind. I knew he was right. I knew that the explanation my reason and my training both repelled and reached towards was the true one. I wonder whether anyone can possibly understand our feelings in that moment, the unmitigable horror of it, and the incredibleness. As the light of the match burned up fully, I saw that the mass of living matter coming towards us was streaked and veined with purple, the veins standing out, enormously distended. The whole thing quivered continuously to each ponderous thud, 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 thud of that gargantuan organ that pulsed within the huge grey-white bulk. The flame of the match reached the captain's fingers, and there came to me a little sickly whiff of burned flesh, but he seemed unconscious of any pain. Then the flame went out in a brief sizzle. Yet at the last moment I had seen an extraordinary raw look become visible upon the end of that monstrous, protruding lappet. It had become dewed with a hideous purplish sweat, and with the darkness there came a sudden charnel-like stench. I heard the matchbox split in Captain Gannington's hands as he wrenched it open. Then he swore in a queer, frightened voice, for he had come to the end of his matches. He turned clumsily in the darkness and tumbled over the nearest thwart in his eagerness to get to the stern of the boat, and I after him. For we knew that thing was coming towards us through the darkness, reaching over the piteous mingled heap of human bones, all jumbled together in the bows. We shouted madly to the men, and for answer saw the bows of the boat emerge dimly into view round the starboard counter of the Derelict. "Thank God!" I gasped out, but Captain Gannington yelled to them to show a light. Yet this they could not do, for the lamp had just been stepped on in their desperate efforts to force the boat round to us. "Quick! Quick!" I shouted. "For God's sake, be smart, men!" roared the captain, and both of us faced the darkness under the port counter, out of which we knew but could not see the thing was coming towards us. "An oar! Smart now! Pass me an oar!" shouted the captain, and reached out his hands through the gloom towards the oncoming boat. I saw a figure stand up in the bows and hold something out to us across the intervening yards of scum. Captain Gannington swept his hands through the darkness and encountered it. "I've got it! Let go there!" he said in a quick, tense voice. In the same instant the boat we were in was pressed over suddenly to starboard by some tremendous weight. Then I heard the captain shout, "Duck your head, Doctor!" And directly afterwards he swung the heavy 14-foot ash oar round his head and struck into the darkness. There came a sudden squelch, and he struck again with a savage grunt of fierce energy. At the second blow the boat righted with a slow movement, and directly afterward the other boat bumped gently into ours. Captain Gannington dropped the oar, and springing across to the second mate, hove him up off the thwart, and pitched him with knee and arms clear in over the bows among the men. Then he shouted to me to follow, which I did, and he came after me, bringing the oar with him. We carried the second mate aft, and the captain shouted to the men to back the boat a little. Then they got her bows clear of the boat we had just left, and so headed out through the scum for the open sea. "Where's Tom Harrison?" gasped one of the men in the midst of his exertions. He happened to be Tom Harrison's particular chum, and Captain Gannington answered him briefly enough. "Dead. Pull. Don't talk." Now, difficult as it had been to force the boat through the scum to our rescue, the difficulty to get clear seemed tenfold. After some 5 minutes pulling, the boat seemed hardly to have moved a fathom, if so much, and a quite dreadful fear took me afresh, which one of the panting men put suddenly into words. "It's got us," he gasped out, "same as poor Tom." It was the man who had inquired where Harrison was. "Shut your mouth and pull!" roared the captain, and so another few minutes passed. Abruptly, it seemed to me that the dull, ponderous thud, 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 thud came more plainly through the dark, and I stared intently over the stern. I sickened a little, for I could almost swear that the dark mass of the monster was actually nearer, that it was coming nearer to us through the darkness. Captain Gannington must have had the same thought, for after a brief look into the darkness he made one jump to the stroke oar and began to double bank it. "Get forward under the thwarts, Doctor," he said to me, rather breathlessly. "Get in the bows and see if you can free the stuff a bit round the bows." I did as he told me, and a minute later I was in the bows of the boat, puddling the scum from side to side with the boat hook and trying to break up the viscid, clinging muck. A heavy, almost animal-like odour rose off it, and the air seemed full of the deadening smell. I shall never find words to tell anyone the whole horror of it all. The threat that seemed to hang in the very air around us, and, but a little astern, that incredible thing coming, as I firmly believe, nearer, and the scum holding us like half-melted glue. The minutes passed in a deadly, eternal fashion, and I kept staring back astern into the darkness, but never ceasing to puddle that filthy scum, striking at it and switching it from side to side until I sweated. Abruptly, Captain Gannington sang out, "We're gaining, lads! Pull!" And I felt the boat forge ahead perceptibly as they gave way with renewed hope and energy. There was soon no doubt of it, for presently that hideous thud, 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 thud had grown quite dim and vague somewhere astern, and I could no longer see the derelict, for the night had come down tremendously dark, and all the sky was thick, overset with heavy clouds. As we drew nearer and nearer to the edge of the scum, the boat moved more and more freely, until suddenly we emerged with a clean, sweet, fresh sound into the open sea. "Thank God!" I said aloud, and drew in the boat hook, and made my way aft again to where Captain Gannington now sat once more at the tiller. I saw him looking anxiously up at the sky, and across to where the lights of our vessel burned, and again he would seem to listen intently, so that I found myself listening also. "What's that, Captain?" I said sharply, for it seemed to me that I heard a sound far astern, something between a queer whine and a low whistling. "What's that?" "It's wind, Doctor," he said in a low voice. "I wish to God we were aboard." Then, to the men, "Pull! Put your backs into it, or you'll never put your teeth through good bread again." The men obeyed nobly, and we reached the vessel safely, and had the boat safely stowed before the storm came, which it did in a furious white smother out of the west. I could see it for some minutes beforehand, tearing the sea in the gloom into a wall of phosphorescent foam, and as it came nearer, that peculiar whining, piping sound grew louder and louder until it was like a vast steam whistle rushing towards us across the sea. And when it did come, we got it very heavy indeed, so that the morning showed us nothing but a welter of white seas, and that grim derelict was many a score of miles away in the smother, lost as utterly as our hearts could wish to lose her. When I came to examine the second mate's feet, I found them in a very extraordinary condition. The soles of them had the appearance of having been partly digested. I know of no other word that so exactly describes their condition, and the agony the man suffered must have been dreadful. "Now," concluded the doctor, "that is what I call a case in point. If we could know exactly what that old vessel had originally been loaded with, and the juxtaposition of the various articles of her cargo, plus the heat and time she had endured, plus one or two other only guessable quantities, we should have solved the chemistry of the life force, gentlemen. Not necessarily the origin, mind you, but at least we should have taken a big step on the way. I've often regretted that gale, you know. In a way, that is, in a way. It was a most amazing discovery, but at the time I had nothing but thankfulness to be rid of it. A most amazing chance. I often think of the way the monster woke out of its torpor, and that scum. The dead pigs caught in it. I fancy that was a grim kind of a net, gentlemen. It caught many things. The old doctor sighed and nodded. "If I could have had a bill of her lading," he said, his eyes full of regret, "it might have told me something to help, but anyway." He began to fill his pipe again. "I suppose," he ended, looking round at us gravely, "I suppose we humans are an ungrateful lot of beggars at the best. But what a chance. What a chance, eh?" And that brings us to the end of The Derelict, and where I shall finish reading tonight's stories. Thank you for listening. Now I stretch. Yeah, so I like that one. That is a fun one to me, and I've had the discussion with Lucy about like that was yucky but good. Yeah, right. And yeah, you're welcome then. I enjoy doing this, even if my room is particularly warm this evening. It feels like, but yeah, I enjoy doing this. It is good fun. I'm glad that people are here to listen to it and enjoy it yourselves. I don't know. I find it interesting and intriguing in the kind of. I guess it sort of does allude to it there in the end that this is the hull of a boat that, like, yeah, per the doctor's suspicions, this is like the hull of a boat that has been in some way wrecked and consumed by, like, life has spontaneously come to exist within it, and sort of wears this boat's hull in a kind of predatory fashion, and it sort of has this scum, like, viscous net around it that captures passing boats and things, and so this is how it preys. This is how it catches its food, by existing as such. Science, probably. Actually, yeah, that's another thing that I actually appreciate about this, because like a lot of so many of the horror stories, the ghost stories, and the sci-fi stories on this have to have that little, like, digression where the author, the protagonist, someone has to step aside and say, Yes, but also, of course, we do believe in God, the Holy Church, the Trinity, and the afterlife, and all that good. God bless us, amen. You have to kind of have that aside. And I kind of actually appreciate the kind of the person who is being told the story, who is, I guess, in a sense, the sort of the overall narrator, the one who is, let's say Hodgson, essentially, who is telling us, questions the Doctor at the start, and we're like, well, hang on, your suspicions about if this is spontaneous life, that stands against all our notions of the afterlife. And the Doctor's like, well, maybe. I appreciate someone in all the fiction that we've read actually sort of saying, well, maybe we don't actually understand everything, and it is possible that life comes about in a different way and isn't just some mysterious, like, God-given thing. There's just a big man with a beard in the clouds who's pointing at stuff saying, you shall live. That actually there may be some weird scientific understanding that we lack, whereby under certain specific conditions life is able to form. That to me feels slightly more scientifically conscious than a lot of the other stuff that we have, that we've read from this sort of era. I don't know, maybe that's just me, but yeah, I actually appreciate that being there in the book. You're gonna have to show a picture of the weird fungus stuff you found a few years ago. No. That just makes me think of I've got it saved somewhere on my phone, but I'd take like 3 minutes to find it, and that would just be 3 minutes of dead air. But their quite famous Tumblr post of someone holding a gun to a mushroom, and like, I'll kill you, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid to pull the trigger or something. And the fungus like, you cannot kill me in any way that matters. And yeah. I kind of find that interesting that Hodgson latched onto those for two separate stories, the Derelicts and The Voice in the Night. Written, Derelict was 1912, Voice in the Night was 1907. 5 years apart. I guess you just like the idea. But yeah, actually, fungus itself, as we know now, being a weird ass thing. Andy Pants, you've got it, thank you. Okay, well, I guess we're going to do a dramatic reading of that. No, I'm not going to read that. It's got words that I'm not going to say. Okay, I'll read the mushroom bit. Can you feel your heart burning? Can you feel the struggle within? The fear within me is beyond anything your soul can make. You cannot kill me in a way that matters. It's good, and yeah, I like this notion of this derelict, this ancient ship that exists at sea in a predatory fashion. That's how it feeds, is by other passing ships seeing it and going, that's a bit weird, and going over to investigate and getting caught in its snare, its net, its weird scum net that it's deployed around it, and you get caught in there, and then you go aboard and you get eaten. That is an interesting concept to me of a way that a predator might hunt. The anglerfish of ships, exactly. It's that same kind of concept. It's like it's how many different things like catch their food. But yeah, like the other thought that I had, which I guess that's where I was saying that the Doctor himself says like it and because I know that the Doctor seems like an authoritative voice in this thing, so he's not going to be speculating on things that are wrong, if that makes any sense. Him saying that it does, he'd love to see like the sort of bill of lading for the ship, to see what was actually on board it that led to this life evolving in the wreck and being able to use it as such. That seems to be, I guess, the correct theory for what has happened here. But I almost kind of like the idea of the entire ship itself being like a naturally, spontaneously occurring predatory life form. That's kind of the reason it sort of looks outwardly like a ship, but is like soft and squishy, isn't because it's the hull of a ship that's gone mouldy, but that because this is the form that has evolutionarily worked out best for this particular life form. That it has evolved. It is just entirely like naturally occurring as such. It is entirely alive and not like a hermit crab wearing, sort of predatory fungal hermit crab wearing the carcass of a ship with which to catch its prey, but actually just some entire, like from top to bottom, some sort of naturally occurring sea beast that looks like a ship but wrong, and just kind of close enough to a ship that people are like, I guess we should go check that out, and sort of paddle over to it, by which point it's too late and you're stuck in its web. I don't know. That is also an interesting concept to me. But anyway, this has been a long one. We are fast coming up on 3 hours, and my voice is probably audibly a little bit scratchy. So I am going to bring things to an end. I do not suspect I shall raid anywhere. No, I do not think I shall raid. It is late and I am tired. But yeah, thank you very much for being here. Ray Tracer, thank you again for the resub. Andy Pants, you resubbed as well 3 hours ago. Oh, was that before the stream started? I forgot to thank you for that. Thank you very much for that. Also, one that was off stream, and I'm going to call it out because I see it. Emsley, thank you for the Prime sub 5 days ago. Very much appreciated. And Dave as well for the raid, I guess. But yes, I'm going to go. I shall not raid. We will, in theory... Wait, we will not be back on Wednesday? Because... No, wait. When is... Wednesday, we might not be back on. I'm not sure. We'll need... Lucy's probably still here and can say, but I think there is a fair chance we might not, but I don't want to speak for her, because I know that, we've got... Yeah, you may or may not be around on Wednesday, exactly. She's got a busy few days. So we may not have anything on Wednesday. Apologies in advance for that. But we will see. Information will, of course, be posted in the social places as best as I can remember to do so, and on the Discord, which is probably the best place to contact us and get information about things. Yeah, either be driving or not. In many ways, summing up the entire human condition, I think, there's two types of people in the world. Either you're driving or you're not. And there we go. There's your philosophical thought to end the day. But I'm going to go. So, yeah, we will maybe see you then. We will see you on the Discord and other places. I might be back next Saturday. Again, things are a little bit, up in the air at the moment. Slightly difficult to plan for. We will definitely be back in August for Book Week, starting on the 14th. But we'll have some streams and stuff before then. But for now... and thank you, Amos, as well. For now, and for this evening, I shall bid you good night, and Godspeed. Have yourselves a good rest of the weekend, however much of it is left to you. Goodbye.